At our Easter dinner, my parents made an exuberant announcement that sent a wave of excitement rippling around the table. They were taking the entire immediate family to Paris in June for my sister's wedding. The room erupted in joyful cheers and clinking glasses. I waited for the noise to settle, then calmly asked what dates we would be flying out. With a theatrical smirk curling at the corners of her mouth, my mother replied that I was not invited, that I should stay home and take care of my sick son, so I would not embarrass the family in front of high society. The room fell into a suffocating silence. I simply smiled and dropped the bombshell they never saw coming. My name is Caroline. I am 33 years old and a single mother to a remarkable 7-year-old boy named Leo, who battles severe asthma and a rare, complex heart condition every single day. To my family, I have always been the ultimate disappointment, the black sheep they tolerate out of obligation. In their minds, I am a struggling freelance accountant who barely scrapes together enough money to survive, hunched over spreadsheets in pajamas inside a cramped, forgettable apartment. What they have absolutely no idea about is that I am actually the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings, a venture capital firm headquartered on Wall Street that manages hundreds of millions of dollars in global assets. The setting for our holiday gathering was the exclusive Oakwood Country Club in Long Island. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm amber glow over the long mahogany table where 20 of our extended family members sat enjoying roasted lamb, fine wine, and the comfortable illusion of old money. I had quietly handed the headwaiter my exclusive black card to cover the entire $6,000 dinner bill before the evening even got started. I did this discreetly, asking the manager to keep the transaction completely private because I was simply exhausted by my parents' constant complaints about credit card limits. For once, I wanted a peaceful holiday, without incident. My mother, Patricia, rose from her chair and tapped her champagne flute with a silver spoon. She wore a designer dress she absolutely could not afford and beamed radiantly at everyone seated around the table. "Attention, everyone," she announced, her voice ringing through the private dining room. "Richard and I have the most wonderful news. We are flying the entire immediate family first class to Paris this June for Madison and Desmond's wedding." The table erupted into thunderous applause. Madison, my 29-year-old sister and the undisputed golden child of our family, held up her hand with practiced elegance to display a massive diamond engagement ring. Seated beside her was her fiancé, Desmond, a striking, charismatic man who dressed exclusively in custom Italian suits and never missed an opportunity to boast about being the chief executive officer of a billion-dollar tech startup. My parents worshipped the ground he walked on, treating him like visiting royalty simply because he projected an aura of limitless, untouchable wealth. I took a measured sip of my sparkling water and looked at my mother with a composed, polite smile. "That sounds absolutely lovely, Mom. What exact dates are we flying out? I need to coordinate Leo's medical schedule with his private physicians well in advance before any international travel." The smile vanished from my mother's face as though someone had switched off a light. She stared at me as if I had tracked mud across a pristine white carpet. She let out a short, clipped, condescending laugh that made the hairs on the back of my neck rise. "You? Oh, Caroline, don't be ridiculous. You are not invited." The lively chatter around the table ground to a complete and uncomfortable halt. Aunts, uncles, and cousins stared in uneasy silence, their eyes darting nervously between me and my mother. I set my glass down slowly and deliberately, keeping my posture perfectly straight. "Excuse me?" My mother crossed her arms, her tone saturated with cold venom. "Paris is for high society. Desmond has personally invited his wealthy business partners and highly successful investors to the ceremony. We cannot have a struggling, frumpy single mother hovering around and ruining the aesthetic of the occasion. Besides, Leo is always coughing or requiring some form of emergency medical attention. You would simply be a massive burden on the entire trip. Stay home in your little apartment and watch your sick son. Don't embarrass us." I turned my gaze toward my father, Richard, expecting even the smallest shred of parental instinct or basic decency to surface. Instead, he dabbed his mouth with a linen napkin and scowled at me across the table. "Listen to your mother, Caroline. Don't start with your usual dramatic victim routine tonight. Madison is marrying a highly successful tech executive. You sit at a computer balancing spreadsheets for pennies. You have been a financial drain and a source of profound shame for this family ever since you got pregnant at 26. You should be immensely grateful we even allowed you to sit at this table tonight." The sheer audacity of his words was almost comical in its detachment from reality. "Grateful?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "Dad, I just personally paid the $6,000 bill for this entire dinner." My father slammed his fist onto the table with enough force to make the expensive crystal glasses tremble and rattle. "Stop lying to make yourself look important. We all know you only survive because of that government assistance program you somehow managed to scam your way into. You are a freeloader, Caroline. You contribute absolutely nothing to this family's legacy, and you never have." Madison leaned forward across the table, a vicious smirk playing on her lips. "Exactly. Desmond's company is currently preparing to go public, and he is reviewing term sheets from major venture capital firms across New York. The last thing we need is my broke, embarrassing sister begging his wealthy friends for handouts at our wedding reception." I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. Years of dominating ruthless boardrooms on Wall Street had taught me with absolute certainty that anger is a useless and self-defeating emotion when you hold all the leverage. I simply leaned back in my leather chair and smiled. The so-called government assistance program my father was so proud of referencing was, in reality, one of the more elaborate jokes of my life. 5 years ago, when my parents were drowning in insurmountable debt and staring down absolute bankruptcy, I had quietly and anonymously established a shell corporation. Through that entity, I had been wiring $8,000 directly into their accounts on the first of every single month. Enough to keep a roof over their heads, food on their table, and their country club membership comfortably active. Their status-obsessed, arrogant minds had somehow convinced themselves it was a special state grant awarded to distinguished citizens of exceptional merit. They were too blinded by pride to recognize that the government simply does not hand out $8,000 a month to people living in luxury suburban estates. I calmly reached into my designer handbag, the one they had always gleefully mocked as a cheap counterfeit, and retrieved my phone. I opened my heavily encrypted private banking portal and navigated directly to the recurring transfers page. There it was, $8,000, reliably scheduled for the first of every month. Without a moment of hesitation, I pressed cancel and permanently deleted the transfer mandate. Then I reached back into my bag and produced the physical bank statement I had brought with me to review earlier that afternoon. I tossed the thick, glossy document directly onto my father's dinner plate. It landed with a soft, decisive thud, sending a small splash of red wine cascading onto his expensive tie. "That is your reality check, Dad," I said, my voice cutting through the stunned room like a blade. "That so-called government grant you have been contentedly living off of for the past 5 years. It came directly from my personal checking account. But don't worry about the Paris trip. You are going to need every penny you can scrape together from this point forward, because as of 5 seconds ago, I just permanently canceled your monthly allowance." My father stared down at the bank statement resting in his ruined plate. The crisp white paper slowly absorbed the spilled red wine, but the numbers printed in sharp black ink were impossible to ignore or dismiss. $8,000 transferred every single month. Originating account Caroline, destination account Richard and Patricia. The color drained completely from his face before a violent, deep crimson flooded back into his cheeks. His fragile ego simply could not process the devastating reality that his comfortable survival had depended entirely on the daughter he had spent years despising and dismissing. He slammed his fist onto the table again, this time with enough force to shatter his crystal wineglass outright. The sharp crack echoed across the entire dining room. "Get out of my house!" he roared, thrusting a trembling finger toward the grand oak double doors. "You are a pathological liar. You forged these documents out of insane jealousy of Madison. You think you can walk into my home, eat at my table, and insult my family with fabricated garbage. Pack your things and get out of here immediately." My mother gasped theatrically, clutching her pearl necklace as though I had physically lunged at her across the table. "You are deeply unwell, Caroline. Your father works incredibly hard to maintain this lifestyle. How dare you attempt to take credit for the government grant he rightfully secured? You are ruining our Easter dinner just to steal attention from your sister. Get out before we call the police for trespassing." Madison crossed her arms and rolled her eyes, releasing a loud, mocking laugh. "Seriously, Caroline, you need professional psychiatric help. You are a broke freelance accountant. You probably printed that fake bank statement at the local public library. Leave my engagement dinner before you humiliate yourself any further. This house belongs to our parents, and you are no longer welcome in it." I remained perfectly still in my chair. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch at a single word of their screaming. I reached back into my designer handbag and retrieved a thick, heavy legal binder. I placed it firmly onto the center of the table. It landed squarely next to the ruined bank statement. The cover displayed the sleek gold-embossed logo of Titan LLC, a real estate holding firm. "This is not your house, Dad," I said, my voice steady and entirely cold. "It has not been your house for 5 years." The room went completely silent. Uncles and aunts exchanged deeply confused glances. My father glared at the binder, his chest heaving with labored, furious breaths. "Let me refresh your memory," I continued, holding direct and unwavering eye contact with him. 5 years ago, you made a series of catastrophic investment decisions in the stock market. You drained your retirement accounts entirely, took out enormous secondary mortgages against the property, and ultimately defaulted on every single payment. The bank initiated a full foreclosure on this beautiful suburban estate. You and Mom were precisely 3 days away from having your belongings deposited on the front lawn by the county sheriff. You were completely and utterly bankrupt. My mother let out a strangled gasp and looked at my father with wide, terrified eyes, silently pleading with him to deny every word of it. He could not. "But a miracle happened," I continued, maintaining absolute composure. "A private real estate firm called Titan LLC stepped in and purchased your debt from the bank in a quiet, all-cash transaction. They allowed you to remain in the property. They paid the property taxes. They covered every major maintenance repair. They essentially allowed you to live here rent-free while you continued parading around the country club, pretending you were still a prosperous and successful businessman." My father swallowed hard, a bead of perspiration rolling visibly down his forehead. "Titan LLC is a corporate landlord," he stammered, his voice stripped entirely of its former authority. "You have absolutely nothing to do with that company. You are just citing nonsense from public property records." I smiled and leaned forward, tapping the heavy binder deliberately. "Open it, Richard." His hands trembled as he reached out and flipped open the cover. The first page contained the official articles of incorporation filed with the state of New York. The second was the property deed. The third was the complete operating agreement. "I am the sole managing member and 100% shareholder of Titan LLC," I stated clearly, allowing the full weight of reality to demolish his considerable ego. I created that shell company specifically to purchase your debt so my son would not have to watch his grandparents become homeless. I own the roof over your head. I own the driveway where you park your leased luxury cars. And given that you just told the actual legal owner of this property to get out, I am formally issuing you a 30-day eviction notice. I plan to list the estate for sale next month. I strongly suggest you begin packing. My mother collapsed back into her chair, pressing both hands over her face as she began to sob uncontrollably. The carefully constructed illusion of her high society life was utterly and irreparably shattered. My father sat paralyzed, staring at my signature on the legal documents with the hollow expression of a man who had just realized he was entirely at someone else's mercy, someone he had spent years underestimating and belittling. The suffocating silence was broken by the slow, deliberate sound of mocking applause. Desmond, my sister's fiancé, stepped forward from the far end of the dining room. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit jacket with practiced composure and looked down at me with an expression of pure, arrogant contempt. "That is a cute little power trip, Caroline," Desmond sneered, shaking his head with exaggerated pity. "You bought a suburban house and you think that makes you some Wall Street titan. It is truly pathetic. You are just a bitter, lonely woman trying to ruin my future wife's special day because you are miserable with your own life." He reached inside his suit jacket and produced a sleek black leather checkbook. He clicked a gold pen, scribbled a figure with casual indifference, tore the check from the binding, and flicked it aggressively in my direction. It fluttered through the air and landed directly on top of the eviction notice. "There is $100,000, Desmond announced, his voice vibrating with theatrical arrogance. "Take that pocket change, pay off whatever pathetic debt you are carrying, and remove yourself from my sight. Madison and I are flying to Paris to plan $1 million wedding. I make more money in a single week than your little real estate stunt is worth. Don't ever disrespect my future in-laws again." My mother immediately perked up, gazing at Desmond as though he were a divine savior. Madison smirked and wrapped her arms around his waist, staring at me with triumphant contempt. I did not get angry. I slowly reached out and picked up the check. It was indeed drawn for $100,000, but the amount was entirely irrelevant to me. What captured my complete and undivided attention was the corporate logo printed in the upper left corner, a stylized geometric hexagon beside the name Nexus Tech Solutions. I stared at that logo, and a slow, genuinely terrifying smile spread across my face. Nexus Tech Solutions was not a billion-dollar startup. It was a fraudulent, hollowed-out company currently under a major, unannounced investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission for running an elaborate Ponzi scheme. And I knew this as an absolute and documented fact, because the chief executive officer of Nexus Tech Solutions had sent a desperate, groveling email to the private inbox of Apex Holdings just that very morning, begging my venture capital firm for a $5 million emergency bailout to avoid federal prosecution. Desmond had absolutely no idea that the woman he had just thrown a check at was the single deciding vote on whether he would spend the remainder of his life behind bars. The morning following the disastrous Easter dinner began with the quiet, familiar hum of medical equipment. Pale sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Manhattan penthouse, casting long, warm rectangles across the hardwood floors. I stood in the doorway of Leo's bedroom, holding a cup of black coffee in both hands. He was still asleep, his small chest rising and falling in steady rhythm with the oxygen concentrator positioned beside his bed. Next month, he was scheduled for his third open-heart surgery, a complex, high-risk procedure to repair a congenital defect that had shadowed his entire short life. Watching him sleep, so fragile yet so inexplicably resilient, quietly fortified every layer of armor I had built around myself over the years. My family had called him a burden the night before. They had told me to stay home and keep him hidden so we would not disrupt their carefully maintained high society illusion. I took a slow, deliberate breath and let the cold, clarifying weight of their cruelty settle permanently into my bones. I walked down the wide hallway to my private home office, a sleek, soundproofed space equipped with multiple trading monitors and encrypted secure servers. As the chief executive officer of a major venture capital firm, I began every morning with a review of global markets and personal investment portfolios. But on this particular morning, my first and only priority was the irrevocable medical trust I had established exclusively for Leo's care and protection. I settled into my leather chair and logged into the encrypted banking portal. The trust was heavily and deliberately funded, designed to guarantee that my son would have immediate, unrestricted access to the world's finest pediatric cardiologists without ever encountering insurance delays or hospital billing limitations. I opened the dashboard expecting to see the solid seven-figure balance I maintained with meticulous discipline. Instead, the numbers on the screen turned my blood to ice. There was a glaring, devastating deficit. My hands flew across the keyboard, pulling transaction logs and cross-referencing account activity with growing dread. My mind cycled through a dozen logical explanations: a banking error, a delayed clearinghouse settlement, an unauthorized sweep from a secondary account. But the truth staring back at me from the high-resolution monitor was far more sinister than any technical glitch. A wire transfer had been initiated and fully processed just 3 business days prior. The amount was exactly $150,000. I traced the international SWIFT routing code and followed it to its destination: an estate management group associated with a 17th-century luxury castle located outside of Paris. The memo line on the transfer read, "Initial deposit for the wedding celebration of Madison and Desmond." The air in the room suddenly felt far too thin to breathe. My own mother had reached into a fund designed to keep her dying grandson alive and stolen from it without hesitation or remorse. She had deliberately drained an account intended to sustain a 7-year-old boy through critical heart surgery, just so her golden child could secure a fairy tale castle venue for a wedding built on fraud. I dug methodically through the digital audit trail and requested the full authorization documentation from the bank. When the records populated on my screen, the sheer, incomprehensible audacity of what she had done left me completely breathless. Years earlier, before I had fully understood the true depths of my parents' toxicity, I had listed my mother Patricia as a contingency emergency contact on a legacy account connected to the medical trust. It was an ancient failsafe, intended solely for a scenario in which I was incapacitated and Leo required emergency surgical intervention. Patricia had weaponized that loophole with cold, deliberate calculation. She had physically walked into a private banking branch, presented herself as a distressed and concerned grandmother in a crisis situation, and submitted a fraudulent emergency authorization claim. And at the bottom of the wire transfer authorization form, in unmistakable ink, was my signature, masterfully forged by the woman who had given birth to me. They had not simply excluded me from a wedding. They had not merely humiliated me at a country club dinner. They had literally reached into my sick child's medical lifeline and torn it out, to pay for champagne flutes, floral arrangements, and a castle in the French countryside. The grief and disbelief I felt in that moment evaporated instantly, replaced by something cold, focused, and absolute. The gloves were not just off, they were incinerated. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct line to my senior wealth manager. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the measured, lethal precision of someone who had made up their mind entirely. I instructed him to freeze the medical trust immediately and flag the $150,000 transfer as a fraudulent transaction involving grand larceny and identity theft against a minor's medical fund. But I was not stopping there. For 5 years, Richard and Patricia had been living comfortably on platinum credit cards I had quietly connected to my corporate umbrella accounts. Cards that had insulated them from bankruptcy and allowed them to play wealthy at their precious country club. I told the banker to terminate every single card bearing their names without exception: gas cards, grocery accounts, emergency lines of credit, travel rewards, severed with a single ruthless command. If they attempted to purchase so much as a cup of coffee or put fuel in their least luxury vehicles that morning, the card would be aggressively declined. They were now completely and irrevocably cut off from every dollar of capital they had spent years treating as their birthright. With the banking perimeter secured, I made the most consequential phone call of my professional life. I dialed my lead corporate attorney, Harrison, a brilliant, calculating legal predator who specialized in hostile takeovers and high-stakes corporate litigation. He answered on the second ring and immediately detected the shift in my demeanor. I kept my eyes fixed on the forged signature displayed on my monitor as I spoke. I asked Harrison to begin drafting a criminal prosecution file without delay. I presented the situation with surgical, emotionless precision, detailing how my mother had committed federal wire fraud, grand larceny, and identity theft in order to steal from a minor's medical trust fund. I heard Harrison exhale sharply on the other end of the line. Even a man who routinely dismantled corrupt corporate executives for a living sounded genuinely repulsed by the sheer depravity of what she had done. He asked if I wanted him to contact federal authorities immediately to have Patricia in handcuffs before lunch. I looked out the window at the sprawling Manhattan skyline, calculating every angle of what came next with absolute clarity. I told him no. A slow, dangerous smile formed across my face. If we arrested her today, she would immediately play the victim, crying to every family member within reach, insisting it had been a tragic misunderstanding about wedding finances. We were going to let them fly to Paris. We were going to let them invite every wealthy aristocrat and social climber they knew, and allow them to perform their untouchable royalty act for one final, glorious audience. I instructed Harrison to prepare the complete embezzlement prosecution file and secure the federal arrest warrants, but to keep everything strictly sealed and confidential. The arrest warrant must be executed at exactly the right moment, I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, deadly whisper. We are going to let them climb to the very top of their high society pedestal, and then we are going to kick it out from under them while the entire world watches. The fallout from severing their financial lifelines was immediate and vicious. Less than 24 hours after I cut my parents off from their stolen luxury, I was seated in the living room of my penthouse reviewing quarterly corporate projections when the private intercom buzzed sharply. My head of building security informed me that 2 agents from Child Protective Services were waiting in the lobby downstairs. They carried an emergency inspection warrant and were demanding immediate entry. My heart rate did not elevate by a single beat. I knew exactly who had sent them. Richard and Patricia had collided with a wall when their platinum cards declined at their favorite country club that morning. Their retaliation was as predictable as it was pathetically transparent. They wanted to strike me where it would hurt the absolute most. They wanted to threaten my custody of Leo, calculating that the fear of losing my son would cause me to crumble and restore their financial access. I told security to send the agents up the private elevator immediately. The heavy steel elevator doors opened directly into my expansive marble foyer. 2 stern, clipboard-clutching agents stepped out with practiced authoritarian composure, clearly primed to enter a neglected, squalid apartment reeking of poverty and desperation. That was the precise and malicious narrative my parents had spun for them. Instead, their expressions faltered visibly as they stepped into an $8 million Manhattan penthouse featuring panoramic floor-to-ceiling views of Central Park. The air was crisp and perfectly filtered by a hospital-grade air purification system I had installed specifically for Leo's respiratory needs. The agents looked around in evident bewilderment, taking in the custom furniture, the immaculate environment, and the unmistakable scale of the wealth surrounding them. I introduced myself without any trace of anxiety and invited them to sit in the formal living room. The lead agent, a tall woman with sharp, perceptive eyes, cleared her throat and attempted to recover her professional composure. She explained that the state had received a deeply distressing anonymous tip claiming I was a financially destitute and emotionally unstable mother who was actively starving my 7-year-old son. The report alleged I was deliberately denying him critical medical care for his severe heart condition, that Leo was living in squalor and danger, and that I was wholly unfit to be his parent. I listened to their entire rehearsed presentation without interrupting once. I did not raise my voice. I did not perform the role of a terrified parent desperately defending herself. I acted precisely as the chief executive officer I was. I rose from my chair and led them down the wide hallway to Leo's private quarters. I opened the door to reveal a room that rivaled the finest pediatric recovery wards in the country. Leo was seated comfortably in his custom-adjustable bed, engaged with a video game on a large screen, while a certified private pediatric nurse quietly checked his oxygen saturation levels. I introduced the agents to the nurse, who stood immediately and handed them a meticulously organized, comprehensive medical binder containing detailed daily health logs, dietary plans developed by a top-tier pediatric nutritionist, and direct contact information for the chief of pediatric cardiology at Mount Sinai Hospital. I told the agents they were entirely free to call the chief of cardiology at that very moment, that I retained him on an extensive private contract to monitor Leo's condition around the clock. The agents reviewed the flawless medical records in complete silence. Their initial suspicion dissolved progressively into profound embarrassment. The lead agent closed the binder, handed it back to the nurse with a heavy apologetic exhale, and turned to me with a sincere apology for the aggressive and distressing intrusion. She acknowledged that the report they had received painted a picture of extreme poverty and criminal neglect, a description that bore absolutely no resemblance to the reality standing before them. I smiled calmly and offered to play them a voicemail I had saved from my father, recorded just 1 hour after his credit cards had been decisively declined at the golf club. In the audio recording, Richard screamed that if I did not restore his financial access and issue a formal apology to the family, he would ensure that the state permanently removed my sick child from my custody. The agents listened to the recording with hardening expressions. They understood immediately that they had been cynically weaponized as instruments in a petty family financial dispute. The lead agent informed me formally that filing a knowingly false child abuse report constitutes a serious criminal offense in the state of New York. She assured me that Child Protective Services would forward the complete case file to the district attorney's office for prosecution, and that my file would be permanently closed and officially classified as a malicious, unfounded report. I escorted both agents back to the private elevator and thanked them genuinely for their thoroughness. The moment the elevator doors slid shut behind them, my personal cell phone buzzed. It was my executive assistant calling from the Apex Holdings corporate office. She sounded alarmed and bewildered in equal measure. She told me that a woman claiming to be my sister was currently screaming at our corporate reception desk over the phone. Madison had apparently visited a high-end designer bridal boutique in Soho that morning to select a custom wedding gown for her Paris ceremony. When her credit card was loudly and publicly declined in front of the boutique's staff and a room full of other wealthy brides, Madison had completely unraveled. Assuming I was merely a mid-level, disposable employee at some generic accounting firm, she had somehow tracked down the corporate phone number for Apex Holdings and was now demanding to be connected with the head of human resources. She was threatening to fabricate damaging lies about my professional conduct until I was terminated and left financially ruined. I laughed out loud, the sound echoing across the empty marble foyer. I instructed my assistant to place Madison on hold for exactly 2 minutes, and then route the call directly to my personal line in the chairman's suite. My arrogant sister wanted to speak to the person in charge to get me fired. She was about to get precisely what she had demanded. I rode the private executive elevator to the top floor of the sleek glass tower on Wall Street that housed Apex Holdings headquarters. Security staff nodded respectfully as I passed through. My corner office occupied the entire top floor, with a breathtaking panoramic view of the financial district stretched out below. I settled into the cool leather of my chair behind my custom walnut desk. My assistant buzzed the intercom to confirm that the woman on line 1 was still screaming profanities at the reception team, demanding to be transferred to the most senior human resources director immediately. I smiled and instructed her to patch the call directly to my personal line. I pressed the speakerphone button and leaned back slowly, steepling my fingers. The line clicked. The sound of my sister breathing heavily, furiously filled the quiet of my office. She was completely unhinged. I could hear the faint background murmur of boutique assistants whispering anxiously to one another. She was still standing inside the luxury bridal shop in Soho, humiliated and seething after being publicly declined. "Listen to me very carefully, you incompetent corporate drone," Madison shrieked into the phone, certain she was addressing some mid-level HR administrator. "I am calling to report one of your employees. Her name is Caroline. She is a low-level freelance accountant who works from her pathetic apartment. She is a thief. She stole money from my parents and maliciously cut off their bank accounts out of pure jealousy because I am marrying a billionaire. I am demanding that you terminate her employment immediately. If she is not fired by the end of the business day, my fiancé will personally acquire your entire miserable firm and liquidate it to put every last one of you on the street." I sat in silence, letting her unhinged threats settle and decay in the air. Madison was so thoroughly blinded by her own arrogance that she had not paused for a single moment to wonder how a supposedly destitute accountant possessed the authority to freeze elite platinum credit cards. She simply wanted to obliterate my livelihood, to punish me for dismantling the lavish lifestyle she believed she was entitled to. Her entire existence rested on the delusion that she was my superior in every conceivable dimension. "Are you deaf?" Madison screamed, her voice fracturing with desperation. "I want her fired right now. She is a toxic, worthless burden to our entire family, and she deserves to be left completely destitute. Tell me you are processing her termination paperwork at this very second, or I will make sure you lose your position as well." I leaned forward and brought my face closer to the speakerphone. I did not raise my voice by a single decibel. I spoke with the calm, lethal authority of a woman who oversaw hundreds of millions of dollars in global assets and answered to no one. "I'm afraid I cannot process that termination request, Madison," I said, my tone laced with quiet, glacial amusement. The line went absolutely silent for a fraction of a second as she recognized my voice. Then her confusion collapsed back into pure, concentrated venom. "Caroline," she hissed, "what the hell are you doing answering this phone? Did they route me to your pathetic cubicle? Put your manager on the line right now. I am going to make absolutely certain you never work in this city again." I allowed a slow, unhurried laugh to move through my corner office. "You seem to have a fundamental misunderstanding of the corporate hierarchy in this particular building, Madison. You did not call a mid-level accounting firm. You called Apex Holdings, and they did not transfer you to a cubicle. My security team routed your tirade directly to the top floor because you were aggressively harassing my reception staff." Madison scoffed loudly, but I could detect the thin tremor of uncertainty beginning to creep into her breathing. "Why would they route anything to you? You're just a number cruncher." "Because you specifically demanded to speak with the person in charge," I replied, letting my voice drop to a quiet, final whisper. But there is no human resources manager in this building with the authority to fire me, Madison. I am not an employee. I am the founder and chairman of the board. I own Apex Holdings. I own the building you just called into. I manage a venture capital fund worth hundreds of millions of dollars. You are currently threatening to acquire a company that could purchase your entire existence, many times over, before lunch. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute and total. The unmistakable sound of a narcissistic mind completely short-circuiting under the weight of an uncomfortable truth. Madison could not begin to comprehend the devastating reality that the sister she had spent years relentlessly bullying, the single mother she had mocked as a poverty-stricken, hopeless failure, was in fact a Wall Street titan who commanded hundreds of millions of dollars. I could practically hear the gears grinding and seizing in her head as the truth began its slow, methodical work of crushing her carefully constructed grand illusion. She realized in real time, with nauseating clarity, that she held no power, no money, and absolutely no leverage against me whatsoever. "You are lying," Madison finally gasped, her voice reduced to something small and unsteady. "You are making all of this up just to frighten me. You are nothing but a pathetic accountant. You do not have that kind of money. You have never had that kind of money." "If I don't have that kind of money, Madison," I countered, allowing the brutal, immovable truth to sink in at its own deliberate pace, "then how exactly do you think I purchased the house you and our parents have been living in? How do you think I paid for the $6,000 dinner last night? How do you think I reached into your wallet this morning and shut off every single credit card you own, leaving you to publicly humiliate yourself inside a bridal boutique in front of everyone? You are nothing but a parasite who has been feeding off the scraps I allowed you to have. And as of right now, the feast is permanently, irrevocably over." Before Madison could even attempt to formulate a coherent response, the heavy oak doors of my office swung open with quiet authority. My executive assistant stepped into the room, gripping a sleek digital tablet with both hands. She was fully aware I was on an active call, but the urgency written across her face made clear that protocol needed to be set aside. I kept the speakerphone fully engaged, ensuring Madison would hear every single syllable of what followed. "Boss," my assistant said, her clear, composed professional voice projecting perfectly across the length of the room. "I sincerely apologize for the interruption, but we have a critical situation escalating rapidly in the lobby downstairs." "Go ahead," I instructed, keeping my eyes fixed on the glowing green light of the active phone line. "It concerns Nexus Tech Solutions," my assistant reported, consulting her tablet. "Desmond, the chief executive officer you asked us to monitor closely, is currently downstairs in the building. He has bypassed his original email request entirely and is practically begging our security team for a direct emergency meeting with you. He is in a state of complete and total panic. He admitted to our reception staff that his company is on the absolute verge of bankruptcy and that he requires a $5 million bailout loan by the close of business today, or he stands to lose everything to federal investigators." I smiled slowly, my eyes drifting toward the speakerphone with calm, predatory satisfaction. I could hear the sharp, horrified intake of breath from Madison on the other end of the line. The invincible billionaire fiancé she had been loudly bragging about to anyone who would listen, the man who had thrown a $100,000 check at my face just the previous evening, was currently standing in my lobby begging for his financial survival. "Tell security to send him up to the executive conference room," I instructed my assistant, my smile widening into something that felt genuinely dangerous even to me. "Tell him the chairman is ready to hear his pitch." I leaned forward toward the speakerphone one final time. "Did you hear that, Madison?" I whispered, my voice dropping to just above a murmur. "It appears your billionaire groom is actually just a desperate, frightened man standing in my lobby with nowhere else to turn. Enjoy your walk home from Soho. I pressed the button and disconnected the call, cutting off whatever panicked, furious scream was gathering in her throat. The trap was perfectly set. The real destruction was about to begin. I remained in my private office, leaning back in my chair with deliberate composure as I studied the high-definition security monitors mounted along the wall. The live surveillance feed displayed the interior of Apex Holdings' primary executive conference room in precise, unflinching detail. The space was an intentionally intimidating fortress of polished glass and cold steel, engineered specifically to make men of Desmond's particular variety feel small, exposed, and powerless. It was working with absolute clinical efficiency. Desmond was pacing the full length of the long mahogany table, dragging a clenched fist across his damp forehead. His custom Italian suit was visibly rumpled and wrinkled, stripped of its usual immaculate presentation. The confident, swaggering arrogance he had performed so effortlessly at Easter dinner had evaporated completely. What remained was the true version of the man, a desperate, cornered rat with the Securities and Exchange Commission closing in from every direction and a $5 million lifeline as his only remaining thread between freedom and a federal indictment. I pressed the intercom button on my desk and instructed Harrison to enter the conference room. I told him simply to let the man dig his own grave and hand him the shovel. I watched through the security cameras as Harrison strode into the room with measured, unhurried authority, carrying a sleek leather folder under one arm. Harrison was a legal predator of the highest order, a man who ate corrupt executives for breakfast and found genuine intellectual pleasure in dismantling their illusions. He did not smile when he shook Desmond's hand. He simply settled into the chair at the head of the table, opened the folder without ceremony, and asked Desmond in a flat, disinterested tone why a supposedly billion-dollar tech startup was appearing at a venture capital firm begging for emergency liquidity on a Tuesday afternoon. Desmond immediately launched into his rehearsed charismatic pitch. He smoothed his tie, adjusted his cufflinks, and flashed his trademark bright, confident smile. Working diligently to project the image of a visionary chief executive officer navigating a minor, temporary inconvenience. He claimed Nexus Tech Solutions was on the very precipice of a transformative public offering and required only a modest bridge loan to cover temporary operational expansion costs ahead of the announcement. He threw around polished buzzwords with the practiced ease of a seasoned con artist: synergy, cloud integration, disruptive algorithms, scalable architecture. It was absolute, elaborately packaged garbage. I sat in my office drinking my coffee and laughing silently at his performance. Harrison cut him off cleanly in mid-sentence. Harrison had absolutely no interest in buzzwords or rehearsed theater. He cared about the glaring, irreconcilable inconsistencies embedded throughout the financial disclosures Desmond had emailed to our offices that morning. Harrison methodically pointed out that Nexus Tech Solutions possessed zero proprietary intellectual property, operated at an unsustainable cash burn rate with no viable revenue model, and had accumulated several deeply alarming inquiries from federal regulatory bodies. He laid each fact on the table with the calm, quiet precision of a surgeon and watched Desmond's composure crumble in real time. Harrison then closed the leather folder, announced that Apex Holdings did not invest $5 million into burning buildings, and stood up to leave the room, executing the psychological pressure play with textbook perfection. Pure, unfiltered panic consumed Desmond's face instantly. He physically leapt from his chair and grabbed Harrison's arm, begging him to sit back down and hear him out. He insisted the company was fundamentally solid and structurally sound, but reluctantly acknowledged a minor cash flow disruption in the lead-up to his wedding. Then he reached into his jacket and produced what he clearly believed was his ultimate trump card. He leaned across the table with the conspiratorial energy of a man who had just remembered he held an ace and began bragging expansively about his wealthy future in-laws. Desmond proudly declared that he was marrying into a high society dynasty of considerable standing. He named my father Richard and my mother Patricia specifically, presenting them as influential real estate moguls who owned sprawling suburban estates and commanded massive generational trust funds. He described my sister Madison as the designated heir to a significant family fortune. He assured Harrison with full sincerity that even if his tech company weathered a temporary financial downturn, his new family possessed more than adequate liquid capital to personally guarantee any and all financial obligations connected to the loan. He was attempting to use the fabricated wealth I had quietly provided to my toxic family as collateral to extract money from my own investment firm. The layered, breathtaking irony of the moment was so exquisitely perfect that I could barely contain the laughter rising in my chest. Through the concealed earpiece Harrison wore during sensitive negotiations, I calmly instructed my attorney to take the bait. I told him to perform genuine, visible interest in the family name, to offer the capital, but with our very specific conditions firmly attached. Harrison settled back into his chair and adopted an expression of intrigued, measured respect. He told Desmond that Apex Holdings placed considerable value on strong connections within established elite networks. He said that if Desmond's future in-laws were as financially formidable and well-positioned as he was representing them to be, the firm would be prepared to expedite the full $5 million wire transfer before the close of business that same day. Desmond released a long, audible breath of relief, and the old, triumphant, arrogant grin spread back across his face. He genuinely believed he had just outmaneuvered one of Wall Street's sharpest legal minds. He believed he had won. But then Harrison reached back into the leather folder and produced a secondary document, sliding it with deliberate calm across the polished table surface. It was a custom-drafted emergency lending agreement, prepared precisely to my specifications. Harrison explained that given the highly irregular and time-compressed nature of the transaction, Desmond would be required to agree to several standard security provisions before funds could be released. What Harrison presented as standard provisions were, in reality, a comprehensive financial death sentence. I had directed Harrison to draft the most predatory, merciless contract available under current securities law. The agreement stipulated that the $5 million loan constituted a personal liability obligation, not a corporate one. Every single personal asset Desmond owned was required as collateral. Furthermore, the contract contained an airtight criminal liability waiver, explicitly stating that if Desmond or any entity connected to Nexus Tech Solutions were found guilty of financial fraud, SEC violations, Ponzi scheme operations, or embezzlement of any kind, Apex Holdings retained the immediate unilateral right to seize total operational control of the company, liquidate all of his personal assets without restriction, and hold him entirely and personally responsible for all resulting legal penalties and federal fines. Harrison placed a gold pen on top of the document and told Desmond with practiced neutrality that the funds would be released the moment his signature appeared on the signature line. He advised Desmond to have his legal counsel review the terms thoroughly before committing, then reminded him, almost as an afterthought, that the offer would expire the instant he chose to walk out the door. I watched the security feed with absolute focus. Desmond stared down at the dense legal language. His hand was visibly trembling. He knew with complete certainty that his company was a total fraud and a house of cards. He knew the SEC was already circling with warrants in hand. He knew, on some level, that placing his signature on that document meant wagering his personal freedom on a lie he could no longer sustain. But greed and desperation are a uniquely blinding combination. He was consumed by the urgent tunnel vision need to secure the cash before his lavish Paris wedding. convinced, with the irrational optimism of a practiced con man, that he could shift the money around, quietly rearrange the ledgers, and quietly disappear into the life of a wealthy French aristocrat before anyone noticed the missing funds. Without reading another sentence, Desmond gripped the pen and signed his full name directly on the dotted line. In that single, irreversible stroke, he legally surrendered his company, his personal assets, and what remained of his freedom directly into my hands. Harrison collected the signed documents, extended a cold, perfunctory handshake, and walked out of the conference room without looking back. I sat in my office, watching through the monitor as Desmond leaned back in his chair and exhaled with the hollow, self-satisfied relief of a man who believed he had just saved himself. He had absolutely no idea that he had done the precise opposite, that he had just personally handed me his signed arrest warrant, neatly bound and notarized. The trap was perfectly and completely sprung. Now it was time to let them all board their first-class flights to Paris and watch the final spectacular destruction begin. 48 hours after I secured the signed agreement with my future brother-in-law, the heavy, methodical hand of the law came knocking on my parents' front door. A federal courier arrived at their suburban estate during their morning coffee, personally serving Richard and Patricia with official court summons for grand larceny and wire fraud in connection with the stolen $150,000 taken from Leo's medical trust. The sheer, unprocessed panic in that moment must have been absolute and overwhelming. Instead of immediately retaining a criminal defense attorney, they did exactly what cornered narcissists invariably do when confronted with inescapable accountability. They drove directly into Manhattan with the full intention of physically intimidating the victim. They still believed with unshakable conviction that I was a disposable, mid-level freelance accountant renting a small desk somewhere in a generic corporate high-rise. They marched through the soaring marble lobby of Apex Holdings, fully intending to seize me by the ear and drag me out to personally withdraw all charges. The sheer audacity of that plan was almost admirable in its stupidity. The ground floor of Apex Holdings is an imposing fortress of polished black granite and biometric security infrastructure. Richard and Patricia bypassed the visitor reception desk entirely and attempted to push their way through the turnstiles as if they had always belonged there. My head of building security intercepted them without hesitation. I watched the entire pathetic spectacle unfold on the high-definition surveillance feed from my penthouse office, coffee in hand. Richard was red-faced and incandescent, jabbing his finger repeatedly into the security guard's chest and demanding to be escorted immediately to the accounting department upstairs. Patricia was clutching her designer handbag like a life raft, weeping loudly and constructing a theatrical scene of maternal devastation to attract sympathy from the hedge fund managers and institutional investors passing through the lobby. She wailed to anyone within earshot that her cruel, emotionally unstable daughter was attempting to destroy their family over a simple financial misunderstanding. They screamed my name until it echoed off the marble walls and vaulted ceilings, demanding that the lowly accountant named Caroline be brought downstairs to face her parents at once. Richard even bellowed at the security chief to summon my manager so that he could have me formally reprimanded for insubordination. I pressed the intercom button on my desk and instructed security to hold them precisely where they stood. I did not dispatch a representative. I did not conceal myself behind the protective layers of my corporate infrastructure. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored blazer with both hands, stepped into my private glass executive elevator, and descended with calm, unhurried deliberateness to the main lobby. When the elevator doors slid open, the chaos ceased instantly, as if someone had cut the sound from a film. The security guard stepped back immediately and nodded with unmistakable deference, parting to create a clear path. My parents stared at me with expressions of complete, disoriented bewilderment. They could not begin to process why a heavily trained armed security team was treating me with the reverence reserved for heads of state. Their confusion lasted only a fraction of a second before their deeply ingrained toxic instincts reasserted themselves. Sensing they were losing the sympathetic attention of the lobby audience, they escalated their performance with everything they had left. Patricia lunged forward against the velvet rope barrier with both hands, her knuckles white. She unleashed a carefully calibrated torrent of emotional manipulation, each word precisely designed to fracture my composure and resurrect whatever residual maternal guilt she imagined still lived in me. She sobbed with practiced theatricality, asking in a breaking voice how I could be so viciously cruel to my own flesh and blood. She screamed that I was attempting to murder this family with a petty, vindictive grudge. "Do you want to destroy your sister's entire future?" Patricia wailed, her voice fracturing with rehearsed grief. "The wedding in Paris will be completely and irreparably ruined if our accounts remain frozen, and we are forced to appear in a courtroom. You are a cold-blooded, heartless monster, Caroline. You have always been consumed by jealousy of Madison, and now you are weaponizing the judicial system purely to sabotage her happiness." She reached forward, attempting to seize my hand and force a moment of physical, maternal connection. I took one slow, deliberate step backward. She cried harder, insisting that a loving daughter would never drag her own mother through a criminal investigation, and that I was tearing an irreparable wound through her heart by choosing to behave like a ruthless sociopath with no conscience. Richard slammed his fist against the security desk with a crack that drew stares from across the lobby, amplifying his wife's manipulation with matching ferocity. He demanded that I take out my phone, call the authorities, and withdraw every criminal complaint immediately. He told me that family always forgives family, that blood was thicker than legal proceedings, and that the money had simply been a temporary loan to help finance the wedding, nothing more. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face and told me that if I refused to resolve this situation at once, I would carry the crushing weight of guilt for having destroyed our family's legacy for the rest of my natural life. They were standing in the lobby of my company, attempting to make me feel profound guilt for prosecuting them for stealing from the medical fund of their 7-year-old grandson, a child scheduled for open-heart surgery. It was the most spectacular narcissistic delusion I had ever witnessed firsthand, and I had witnessed quite a few. I stood perfectly still and allowed their toxic, carefully aimed poison to wash over me without absorbing a single particle. I did not raise my voice. I did not attempt to justify my actions or explain the obvious reality that one simply cannot withdraw funds from a minor's pediatric medical trust to pay for a Parisian castle deposit. I reached calmly into my leather portfolio and produced a crisp, thick legal document bearing the official embossed seal of the state Supreme Court. I walked directly to the velvet rope and pressed the document firmly against my father's chest, forcing him to take it with both hands. I looked directly and without blinking into his panicked eyes. "I am not withdrawing anything," I stated, my voice carrying across the silent marble lobby with absolute clarity. "That paper you are holding is not a warning letter or a courtesy notice. It is an expedited eviction order, signed by a judge this morning. You and my mother have precisely 24 hours to pack your belongings and vacate my property." Richard looked down at the eviction notice in his trembling hands, and I watched in real time as the full weight and totality of his ruin finally settled into his bones. He opened his mouth. No words emerged. The arrogant patriarch, the man who had told me for decades that I contributed nothing and would amount to nothing, was completely and utterly broken. "The law has absolutely no room for mercy," I added, already turning my back on them both. "And neither do I." I signaled the guards with a single nod to formally escort my parents from the premises. But as Patricia was being physically guided toward the revolving glass doors, she dug both heels into the marble floor and released a raw, desperate, full-throated shriek that filled every corner of the lobby. The manufactured tears evaporated instantly, replaced by something unmasked and genuinely vicious. "You think you have won, Caroline?" she screamed, her face contorted into an expression of pure, cornered hatred. "I am going directly to the press. I will personally call every major newspaper in this city and expose you as a deranged, abusive daughter who destroys her own family for sport. I will burn your professional reputation to the ground and reduce everything you have built to ash." Patricia was not making idle, emotional threats in the lobby of my building. Within 48 hours, my public relations team began intercepting a steady stream of inquiries from bottom-tier tabloid journalists, fishing for a damaging statement. Richard and Patricia had driven straight from my corporate headquarters back to the familiar comfort of their beloved Oakwood Country Club, desperate to reclaim some semblance of social footing. Richard planted himself at the mahogany bar in the men's lounge and set about weaving an elaborate, masterful web of deliberate fiction over poured glasses of expensive scotch. He performed the role of the devastated, heartbroken patriarch with considerable skill for the prominent real estate developers and retired hedge fund managers who gathered around him. He told them that his eldest daughter had completely lost her grip on reality. He claimed I was a ruthless, ungrateful monster who was illegally attempting to evict her elderly parents onto the street out of nothing but petty, irrational spite. He omitted, with impressive thoroughness, the fact that he had been technically bankrupt for 5 years and that the house legally belonged to my holding company. He made no mention whatsoever of the grand larceny charges connected to his grandson's medical trust. He cast himself as a successful, dignified patriarch, being unfairly and mercilessly targeted by a vindictive, disturbed child. The country club elite absorbed every word of it. They pledged to leverage their combined media connections to expose me and dismantle my firm in order to defend their old friend from his monstrous daughter. My corporate communications director appeared in my doorway, urgently advising me to release a preemptive public statement designed to neutralize the tabloid rumors before they accumulated any meaningful momentum. I shook my head and told her to stand down immediately. I do not play defense. I do not engage with gossip columns or respond to the theater of public opinion. I fight with capital, and I fight with the permanent eradication of the threat at its source. I summoned Harrison to my office and instructed him to pull the complete financial dossiers on every man seated at that country club bar with my father. Apex Holdings maintained unparalleled institutional access to global debt portfolios and international credit networks. It took my legal team exactly 3 hours to construct a detailed map of the financial vulnerabilities belonging to Richard's 5 closest and loudest allies. The results were illuminating in the way that all uncomfortable truths tend to be. The men who had been boasting loudest about their considerable wealth at Oakwood Country Club were, beneath the surface, drowning in carefully concealed liabilities of their own. One of Richard's closest friends, a prominent luxury automobile dealership owner who drove a different exotic car to the club each week, was severely overleveraged on commercial real estate loans and quietly facing a serious liquidity crisis that threatened his entire business portfolio. Another trusted golf companion, a local politician with a freshly pressed reputation, had discreetly taken out a predatory high-interest bridge loan to quietly prop up his failing restaurant franchise chain. I instructed Harrison to aggressively acquire every piece of their outstanding debt through our network of shadow holding companies. By the close of that business day, Apex Holdings stood as the sole primary creditor for the 5 most vocal men publicly defending my father at the country club bar. I legally owned their financial futures and held in my hands the absolute authority to push any one of them into immediate public bankruptcy proceedings without notice. I did not send attorneys to knock on their doors. I did not make threatening phone calls. I simply had my wealth management team forward a single, highly confidential email to each of those specific individuals. Each email contained two attachments. The first was a formal legal notice stating that their commercial debt obligations had been successfully acquired by my firm and were immediately subject to comprehensive audit. The second was a carefully redacted copy of the federal wire fraud indictment file Harrison had prepared, containing irrefutable banking documentation establishing that Richard was entirely bankrupt and had recently forged his own daughter's signature to steal $150,000 from a 7-year-old child's emergency open-heart surgery fund. I included a brief, polite closing message stating that Apex Holdings strongly preferred not to conduct business with individuals who chose to publicly associate with child abusers and convicted thieves. The implied alternative was unmistakable. The response was instantaneous, catastrophic, and thoroughly satisfying. The elite membership of Oakwood Country Club did not care about friendship, loyalty, or the bonds forged over decades of shared golf rounds and expensive dinners. They cared with absolute single-mindedness about their own survival and the preservation of their own accounts. The moment they understood they were publicly defending a bankrupt criminal while simultaneously risking their own financial empires, they turned on Richard with a savage, breathtaking speed that left no room for sentiment. The following afternoon, Richard walked through the country club gates expecting to be met with sympathetic nods, warm handshakes, and renewed promises of solidarity in his battle against his wicked daughter. Instead, he was intercepted at the entrance by the club president and two armed security guards. I received the full, detailed account from one of my newly acquired debtors, who was by then deeply motivated to demonstrate his personal loyalty to me with considerable enthusiasm. Richard was publicly escorted from the dining room in front of the assembled membership board. The full humiliation played out before an audience who had known him for 30 years. His former allies shouted openly at him across the dining room floor, calling him a fraud, a criminal, and a man without basic human decency. They demanded to know how he had the audacity to sit at their tables and drink their aged whiskey, while his signature sat on documents proving he had stolen money from a gravely ill child. The club president formally revoked his lifetime membership on the spot, physically cutting his laminated access card in half with a pair of scissors and issuing a permanent, unconditional ban from the premises. Richard was deposited on the sidewalk outside the gates, stripped of his last remaining piece of the high society armor he had spent his entire adult life constructing. Completely humiliated, socially annihilated, and utterly alone. The tabloid reporters dropped the smear campaign entirely within hours of receiving anonymous tips from those same former friends detailing the wire fraud investigation. The media blackout was swift and absolute. While my parents were in the process of losing their house, their reputation, their social circle, and everything else they had built their identities around, my sister Madison remained completely, serenely detached from reality. She was utterly and exclusively consumed by the glittering delusion of her impending billionaire wedding in France. She refused to acknowledge, appeared genuinely incapable of acknowledging, that her parents were currently packing their remaining possessions into garbage bags in a house they no longer legally occupied back in New York. That evening, I was sitting on my velvet sofa watching Leo play quietly with his toys on the floor beside me when my phone buzzed with a social media alert. Madison had just updated her public Instagram story. The photograph showed her holding 2 first-class boarding passes to Paris, her perfectly manicured nails arranged artfully over the cover of a vintage luxury luggage set. She was positioned in the private VIP departure lounge at John F. Kennedy International Airport, a tall flute of expensive champagne held loosely between two fingers, her head tilted at the precise angle of someone who has practiced the pose. The caption beneath the photograph was saturated with the particular brand of performative arrogance that had always been her most consistent quality. Leaving all the poor, jealous losers behind to go marry my billionaire prince in a French castle. Some people are simply born for greatness, while others are destined to stay at home and be miserable. Catch you in Paris, peasants. I stared at the glowing screen for a long, quiet moment. Madison genuinely believed she had won. She was boarding a first-class flight with complete radiant confidence, absolutely certain she was ascending to the fairy tale life she had always believed was her birthright, funded in part by money stolen directly from her nephew's surgical care fund. She had no comprehension whatsoever that the man sitting beside her in that departure lounge had already signed his entire existence, his company, his assets, and his freedom, over to my firm. She had no idea that the castle awaiting her in the French countryside was already a stage set for a very different kind of ceremony than the one she had planned. I locked my phone, set it face down on the cushion beside me, and felt a quiet, crystalline rush of cold anticipation move through me. I kissed Leo on the top of his head, stood up, and walked to my desk. I pulled out my custom-embossed passport from the top drawer. I pressed the intercom button and connected directly to my private aviation team. I instructed my pilot to fuel the company jet and file a direct flight plan for Charles de Gaulle Airport. The domestic chapter of this conflict was officially concluded. The war was relocating to Paris, and I intended to arrive as the only guest who mattered. 4,000 miles away, my toxic family was intoxicating itself on stolen glory with the unrestrained enthusiasm of people who have never once been made to face consequences. Madison and Desmond had commandeered the grandest suites available at a landmark luxury hotel in central Paris, funding the reservation using the final drained remnants of liquidity siphoned from Desmond's collapsing corporate scheme. Money built on fraud, supplemented by blood money taken directly from a 7-year-old boy's heart surgery fund. My private surveillance team confirmed that Richard and Patricia had slipped onto an overnight commercial flight immediately following their humiliating public removal from the country club. They were now parading through the French capital with the manufactured ease of people who had decided, by sheer force of will, that the eviction notices back home simply did not apply to them. Madison was flooding every social media platform with a curated cascade of heavily filtered photographs, rare white truffles delivered to their suite, custom couture fittings at a private Parisian atelier, crystal flutes of vintage champagne held up against golden afternoon light. She posted videos of Desmond pressing crisp $100 bills into the palms of hotel concierges with the casual, performative generosity of a man who needs the world to believe he has more money than he knows what to do with. They moved through Paris like visiting royalty, blissfully, completely, cosmically unaware that their entire European fantasy was constructed on a foundation of federal wire fraud, forged signatures, stolen funds, and imminent international indictments that were already in motion. They had convinced themselves, with the breathtaking irrationality of people who have never been truly stopped, that the consequences could be outrun simply by crossing the Atlantic Ocean. They thought wrong. Before I could cross that ocean to personally deliver their final reckoning, there was one absolute priority that required my complete and undivided attention. I personally drove Leo to the private pediatric wing at Mount Sinai Hospital for his intensive pre-surgical admission. I did not rely on the hospital's standard security infrastructure. I brought in my own elite private security detail, a team of former federal agents with impeccable records, and stationed them in rotating shifts at the entrance to his recovery suite around the clock, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I delivered the Chief of Security a comprehensive, non-negotiable list of specifically authorized medical personnel. I gave explicit instructions that if Richard, Patricia, or Madison attempted to contact the hospital from overseas by any means whatsoever, phone call, email, third-party representative, they were to be treated immediately and formally as hostile external threats. If any unauthorized individual set foot on that floor for any reason, they were to be detained and arrested for trespassing without hesitation or negotiation. I leaned over Leo's bed and pressed my lips to his forehead, promising him in a quiet voice that his medical trust was fully secured, completely replenished, and protected by more legal and financial barriers than anyone could dismantle. I told him that Mommy had to take a quick business trip to take out some trash that had been left behind. He smiled up at me with the particular, uncomplicated trust of a 7-year-old boy who has always known his mother would handle whatever needed handling, and he squeezed my hand with both of his. He was safe. He was protected. He was entirely insulated from the war I was currently concluding on his behalf. With my son guarded and settled, I stepped out of the hospital and into the back of my waiting armored SUV. My driver bypassed the sprawling, chaotic commercial terminals of the international airport without a second glance and navigated directly to the private executive tarmac at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey. The sleek, heavily modified Gulfstream jet bearing the understated Apex Holdings logo was standing on the runway, its engines already producing a low, powerful whine of readiness and latent authority. There were no baggage queues, no body scanners, no indignities of commercial travel that my sister had photographed herself enduring in first class for her social media audience. I walked up the illuminated boarding stairs and stepped into the flying boardroom that served as my mobile command center across continents. The flight attendant handed me a tall glass of sparkling water as I settled into my seat at the polished mahogany conference table suspended 40,000 feet above the earth. As the jet lifted cleanly from the tarmac, sliced through the cloud layer, and set a direct, unwavering course for Europe, I opened my encrypted laptop and connected to the secure corporate server. The transatlantic crossing would give me 7 uninterrupted hours at altitude to orchestrate with surgical precision the absolute, final, and complete annihilation of Desmond's fraudulent empire, and to ensure that when it fell loudly, publicly, and in front of exactly the audience I intended. Harrison, my lead corporate attorney, had uploaded the completed prosecution dossiers to our secure offshore server well ahead of my landing. I opened the encrypted digital file labeled Nexus Tech Solutions and began my final review with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who has already won and is simply confirming the details. Desmond had made the catastrophically foolish decision to transfer the last remaining dregs of his company's liquid funds into European offshore accounts in the days leading up to the wedding, clearly hoping to launder the money through the extravagant expenses of his rehearsal dinner and ceremony. In doing so, he had violated 3 separate federal banking statutes the precise moment that capital crossed an international border. Every dollar he moved became evidence. Every wire transfer became a nail in his coffin. I reviewed the airtight legal architecture Harrison had constructed with the quiet satisfaction of a chess player examining a board where every piece is already in position. By signing that emergency loan agreement in my conference room, Desmond had legally and irrevocably surrendered complete operational control of his company to Apex Holdings. I was now, in the most technically precise sense of the words, his employer, his primary creditor, and his sole executioner. I drafted a direct, carefully worded communication to my highest-level contacts at the Securities and Exchange Commission in Washington. I attached the fully unredacted internal ledgers proving beyond any reasonable doubt that Desmond had been operating a $50 million financial scheme. systematically defrauding hundreds of angel investors over several years in order to fund his custom-tailored suits, his fleet of luxury sports cars, and his performance of being a self-made billionaire. Because the stolen funds had now physically crossed into European financial jurisdiction, the underlying crime was no longer a domestic fraud matter. It had escalated into a case of international money laundering, which brought it under the jurisdiction of entities with considerably longer and less forgiving reach. I opened a secondary encrypted communication channel to the Financial Crimes Division of Interpol. I transmitted the comprehensive forensic audit establishing with GPS-level precision that Desmond was currently spending illicit funds on French soil in a 17th-century chateau outside Paris, surrounded by wealthy investors he intended to continue defrauding. I included the exact coordinates of the Château de Villers, where the rehearsal dinner was already underway. I did not want him sued in a civil court. I did not want a quiet settlement negotiated behind closed doors. I wanted him physically extracted from his own rehearsal dinner by heavily armed European law enforcement in front of every investor and socialite he had spent months cultivating. The humiliation had to be public. The destruction had to be complete and witnessed. I entered a short authorization code on my keyboard and pressed send. The encrypted files vanished from my outbox, distributed instantaneously to the highest operational levels of global financial law enforcement. There was no recall option. There was no undo button. The countdown to their absolute and total ruin had officially and irreversibly begun. For the remainder of the flight, I rested my eyes and allowed the steady, low hum of the Gulfstream's engines to move through me like a slow, calming current. I was not anxious. I was not agitated. I was the corporate equivalent of a surgeon scrubbing in before a long-planned procedure, composed, precise, entirely prepared to cut a malignant tumor out of my life with permanent finality. The Gulfstream touched down with smooth, practiced elegance on the private executive runway at Paris Le Bourget Airport, just as the golden hour sun spread its warm, famously deceptive glow across the French capital. The kind of light that makes everything look grander and more forgiving than it actually is. Before the cabin doors had even swung open, my encrypted phone buzzed with an incoming message from Harrison. The text was brief to the point of surgical economy, but it carried the unmistakable weight of a guillotine blade completing its descent. Harrison confirmed that the French Economic Police and Interpol's Financial Crimes Division had received the dossiers, conducted an expedited review of the irrefutable evidence of international fraud, and mobilized their tactical units accordingly. The arrest warrants were fully active, cross-referenced with local Parisian law enforcement, and being held in readiness for deployment at my signal. I stepped off the jet and into the crisp, cool air of a European evening. A custom matte black Maybach with deeply tinted privacy glass was idling silently on the tarmac, waiting exclusively for me. My personal protection detail opened the heavy, reinforced rear door and I settled into the immaculate leather interior. The driver caught my eye in the rearview mirror, waiting for instruction with patient, professional stillness. I adjusted the cuffs of my bespoke blazer and allowed myself one long, quiet look at the glittering cityscape spreading across the horizon. "Take me to Château de Villers," I said, my voice entirely devoid of hesitation or mercy. "It is time for the rehearsal dinner." The Maybach's tires rolled with a soft, aristocratic crunch across the pristine gravel of the Château de Villers approach. The 17th-century French estate was bathed in warm, golden architectural uplighting, projecting a flawless, entirely convincing illusion of generational wealth and effortless aristocratic permanence. I remained still in the plush leather rear seat, observing the rehearsal dinner unfolding in full, elaborate display through the chateau's massive floor-to-ceiling glass terraces. Desmond had spared absolutely nothing. Every dollar of the stolen funds from my son's medical trust and the final reserves drained from his collapsing corporate scheme, deployed for maximum theatrical effect. The courtyard overflowed with imported white orchids arranged in towering formations, elaborate crystal champagne towers that caught the light of 100 candles, and a live classical orchestra positioned beneath a marble portico. The guest list was a carefully curated assembly of arrogant venture capitalists, European socialites with old surnames and nervous new money, and the naive angel investors Desmond had spent the better part of a year luring to this exact moment to legitimize his fraudulent empire with their physical presence and implied endorsement. He was stationed by the grand central fountain wearing a bespoke velvet tuxedo, holding court with a cluster of older businessmen, laughing with the full-throated confidence of a man who genuinely believes he has already won. My parents, Richard and Patricia, circulated effortlessly among the French elite, holding their crystal champagne flutes with the polished, rehearsed elegance of people who have spent decades practicing the appearance of belonging somewhere they have no right to be. They moved through the gathering as though they were generational tycoons at a family estate, suppressing with impressive discipline the reality that they were bankrupt frauds facing federal indictment back in New York, currently in possession of a 24-hour eviction notice on a house they no longer owned. And there was Madison. She was draped in a ridiculously extravagant hand-beaded silk gown, moving through the room like a reigning monarch receiving the affectionate tribute of her loyal court, entirely oblivious to the financial guillotine hovering with perfect, silent precision directly above her neck. I signaled my private security detail, 2 former federal agents, tall, broad-shouldered, and radiating the particular quiet authority of men who have operated in genuinely dangerous environments, stepped out of the trailing black SUV and flanked the Maybach's doors. I stepped out into the Parisian night air. I was not wearing the sensible, forgettable clothing of the struggling freelance accountant my family had spent years condescending toward. I was wearing a custom-tailored emerald green haute couture gown that moved with my frame with the precision of something architectural. Around my neck rested a genuine diamond collar that had cost more than the entire heavily mortgaged suburban estate my parents had just been formally evicted from. Every carefully considered detail of my appearance had been calibrated with a single purpose: to completely and publicly annihilate Madison on her own battlefield, on what she believed would be the most triumphant night of her constructed life. My security detail marched ahead with measured authority toward the grand entrance of the main ballroom. The massive oak doors stood 20 feet high, flanked by the chateau's private security staff. My men produced their international credentials with quiet efficiency and pushed the doors open with both hands. The heavy wood groaned with a resonance that rolled across the entire cavernous ballroom like a thunderclap. The sudden, violent sound cut through the refined high society chatter of hundreds of guests like a blade through silk. The string orchestra ceased playing mid-phrase. Hundreds of polished, expensively dressed heads turned in simultaneous, startled unison to see who had dared to interrupt their exclusive gathering in such a manner. I stepped across the threshold. My diamond-heeled shoes clicked against the polished marble floor with slow, deliberate rhythm, each step landing with the measured authority of someone who owns the room she walks into. The collective intake of breath from the assembled guests was audible and immediate. The venture capitalists and tech investors who had spent the evening nodding along to Desmond's practiced presentations suddenly stood straighter, drawn forward by the unmistakable gravitational pull of genuine, unperformed power. I did not look at them. I locked my eyes directly on my family. The color drained from Richard and Patricia's faces with a speed that was almost medically alarming. Richard's hand lost its grip on his champagne flute. It fell and shattered against the marble with a sharp musical crash. Patricia seized the edge of the nearest cocktail table with both hands, her mouth hanging open in undisguised, paralyzed terror. Desmond froze entirely mid-sentence, his confident smile collapsing into an expression of profound, searching confusion. He recognized me as the woman he had thrown a check at across a country club dinner table, but his brain struggled violently to reconcile that memory with the reality of a woman standing in a French chateau, dripping in millions of dollars of authenticated jewelry, and carrying herself as though she owned the building. But Madison had the most visceral, most immediate, most catastrophically revealing reaction of all. The Golden Child experienced a complete psychological collapse in real time, right in front of the assembled European elite she had spent months dreaming of impressing. Her eyes widened past any pretense of composure as she absorbed my gown, my jewelry, the quiet command of my entrance. I had effortlessly and completely eclipsed her on the single most important night of her fabricated adult life, without raising my voice or breaking my stride. Her shock lasted approximately 2 seconds before it collapsed inward and erupted outward as raw, unhinged, feral rage. "What the hell is she doing here?" Madison shrieked, her voice tearing across the silent ballroom with a pitch that made several guests visibly flinch. She leveled a shaking, perfectly manicured finger at my face, abandoning in an instant every carefully maintained affectation of high society refinement. "Security, remove her immediately. She is a trespassing, broke accountant. She sneaked in here to ruin my wedding. Throw her out into the street right now." The chateau's security guards hesitated visibly, their eyes moving uncertainly between Madison's hysteria and the composed professional authority of my elite protection detail. Madison stamped her foot against the marble floor, her face darkening to an ugly shade of scarlet. "Did you hear me? I said throw that parasite out this instant." Patricia, snapping free of her paralysis and recognizing with desperate urgency that their entire constructed web of lies was seconds from exposure before the wealthiest audience they had ever cultivated, allowed her panicked survival instinct to override what remained. She lunged forward from the crowd, her face twisted into something genuinely ugly, a mask of pure, cornered malice stripped of every layer of social veneer. She raised her hand high and swung it with full force toward my face, fully intending to deliver a public, humiliating slap that would assert her maternal authority in front of everyone watching. She came nowhere close. Before Patricia's hand completed its arc, one of my bodyguards moved with the kind of speed that makes trained professionals look effortless. He caught her wrist cleanly in midair and locked it in a grip of cold, professional control. He applied just enough measured, precise pressure to bring her to her knees on the marble floor without causing injury, but without offering a single centimeter of release. Patricia let out a strangled, humiliated gasp and struggled against the hold with the impotent thrashing of someone who has never before encountered a consequence she could not talk or cry her way out of. I did not flinch. I did not step backward. I looked down at my mother on the marble floor with a slow, unhurried, ice-cold smile. Then I stepped gracefully around her, as one steps around something inconvenient left on a path, and ignored the continued hysteria of Madison's screaming entirely. I walked in a straight line up the center aisle of the ballroom, commanding with my silence and my pace the undivided attention of every billionaire and investor remaining in the room. I ascended the marble steps to the grand stage, approached the visibly terrified master of ceremonies, and smoothly removed the silver microphone from his trembling hand. The microphone was cool and solid and perfectly weighted. I stood at the center of the elevated stage and looked out across a sea of impeccably tailored suits and glittering evening gowns. The opulent ballroom of the Château de Villers was so completely, so suddenly still, that I could hear the faint rustle of silk and the ragged, humiliated breathing of my mother, still restrained on the marble floor below. I tapped the microphone once. The sharp electronic tone rang off the frescoed ceilings with complete authority. "Good evening, distinguished guests. I began, my voice carrying across the room with the unhurried, self-assured projection of someone who has addressed hostile boardrooms on every continent. For those of you who do not yet know me, my name is Caroline. I am the older sister of the bride-to-be. I am also the specific family member who was personally and deliberately excluded from attending this extraordinary celebration. I let that settle for precisely one beat. My family informed their country club associates that I was occupied with business abroad. They told several of you that I was a mentally unstable freelance accountant who would only embarrass them at a gathering of this caliber. The truth is considerably more straightforward than that. They simply could not afford to have me present tonight, because my presence makes their carefully constructed illusion of generational wealth impossible to maintain. I looked directly at Madison. She was trembling where she stood, her extravagant silk gown pooling around her feet like a slowly deflating fantasy. The pristine, curated image she had spent months building for this specific audience was cracking in real time, under the light of a chandelier she had paid for with her nephew's heart surgery money. Despite not receiving an invitation, I felt it was my obligation as a loving older sister to make the journey across the Atlantic this evening to deliver a wedding gift. I paused for a fraction of a second, allowing the warmth of the word gift to sit uneasily in the air. A gift that I believe encapsulates with remarkable precision the moral bankruptcy of the people who have been hosting you so generously tonight. I raised my right hand and snapped my fingers once, a clean, deliberate, predetermined signal. From the shadows of the grand arched doorways on every side of the ballroom, 6 members of my private security team stepped forward in measured, unhurried unison. Each carried a heavy, sleek black leather portfolio. With the quiet, impersonal precision of a military logistics operation, they fanned out across the entire floor space of the ballroom and moved systematically from table to table, placing one thick, meticulously organized dossier at the center of every single dining arrangement without exception. The wealthy guests exchanged wary, uncertain glances. The tech investors Desmond had spent the entire evening cultivating reached out with cautious fingers and opened the dark folders. I leaned slightly into the microphone. I strongly encourage you to review the contents. Let us begin with the first document on the left. I gave them a moment of deliberate silence in which to locate it. That is an official bank statement accompanied by a federal wire transfer authorization form. You may notice the sum is exactly $150,000. Another pause. Precise. Controlled. That money was not drawn from a family fortune. It was stolen. My mother, Patricia, forged my signature 4 days ago to unlawfully drain that exact amount from an irrevocable pediatric medical trust. A collective gasp moved through the ballroom like a physical wave. The sound of crystal glasses being set down carefully, deliberately, echoed from multiple directions simultaneously as the weight of what I had said began to register in the room. That medical trust belongs to my 7-year-old son, Leo, I continued, allowing my voice to drop by a single register, not to softness, but to something colder and more precise. Leo was born with a severe congenital heart defect. He is scheduled for open heart surgery before the end of this month. Patricia committed federal wire fraud and grand larceny to reach into her own grandchild's life-saving surgical fund. And the reason she did it, the specific purpose for which she forged those documents and stole that money, was to pay the deposit on this chateau. I allowed the silence to do its work for 3 full seconds. The vintage champagne you are currently holding, the imported white orchids at the center of your tables, the very chair my sister is sitting on. All of it was purchased with blood money stolen from a dying 7-year-old child. The reaction was immediate, visceral, and deeply gratifying. Several of the aristocratic women physically recoiled from the table, pushing their champagne flutes away as though the crystal itself had become contaminated. The venture capitalists who had been nodding along to Desmond's business projections just minutes prior stared down at the banking documents with the cold, rapidly sharpening focus of people who recognize irrefutable evidence of federal financial crimes. Because they were predators themselves, and they had not reached their positions by being unable to read a balance sheet. My father, Richard, finally broke out of his cataleptic silence. He lurched forward from the crowd, waving both hands above his head with the frantic, theatrical energy of a drowning man. "Do not listen to a word she says," he shouted across the room, his voice cracking under the pressure of his own desperation. "She is entirely unstable. She fabricated every single one of those documents to destroy our standing. We are established investors. We own a significant estate in New York. This is a malicious, deranged lie." His voice was losing altitude with every syllable. I smiled at him with patient, almost affectionate composure, and pointed toward the portfolios distributed across the room. "I would invite everyone to turn to the second page of the dossier," I said, projecting calmly over Richard's increasingly hollow protestations. The sound of heavy parchment turning filled the ballroom in a quiet, damning wave. "What you are looking at now is a legally executed Supreme Court eviction order," I stated clearly. "My parents do not own a significant estate. They have been entirely and completely bankrupt for 5 consecutive years. I discovered their situation half a decade ago and quietly purchased their foreclosed property through a corporate holding company of my own creation, specifically to prevent them from losing their home. I did this without their knowledge and without their acknowledgement or gratitude." I gave that fact a moment to breathe. Yesterday morning, following the events of Easter dinner and the discovery of the theft from my son's medical fund, I formally and legally evicted them from that property. They are entirely destitute. They are legally homeless. They flew to Paris on stolen money, hoping to secure this marriage alliance before the full scope of their financial reality became known to anyone in a position to care. The ballroom descended into a controlled chaos that was beautiful to witness. The elegant, curated architecture of the rehearsal dinner dismantled itself in real time. Wealthy investors began rising from their chairs, buttoning their jacket buttons with the brisk, decisive movements of people removing themselves from a situation that could damage them by association. The high society guests looked at my family with expressions ranging from cold revulsion to the particular kind of theatrical disgust reserved for people caught doing something irrevocably beneath them. Patricia abandoned all pretense and began to sob with full theatrical abandon on the marble floor, thrashing against the iron grip of my bodyguard and wailing that her life was comprehensively and unjustly ruined. Madison pressed both hands over her face and released a high, agonizing scream as the entire fabricated architecture of her adult identity collapsed with the speed and completeness of a controlled demolition. But Desmond did not cry. He did not freeze. His enormously fragile narcissistic ego, the one that had been performing confidence and dominance in every room he had entered for years, snapped with a violence that was almost impressive to witness. The threat to his billionaire illusion, in front of the exact investors he still needed to defraud, triggered something primal and uncontrolled. He released a guttural roar of sheer fury, shoved his way past several retreating guests with no regard for who he knocked aside, sent a towering crystal floral arrangement crashing across the floor in an explosion of water and glass, and stormed up the marble steps to the stage with his eyes bulging and his chest heaving. He seized the silver microphone directly from my hands with a force that he clearly intended to be commanding and physical. My security team moved instantly. I raised one hand, a single, unhurried gesture, and they held their positions. I wanted him to speak. I needed him to speak. I needed the room to hear exactly what kind of man he was, in his own voice, under genuine duress, with nothing left to lose. "You are a lying, jealous woman!" Desmond screamed into the microphone, his voice amplified by the acoustics of the ballroom until it rang off the frescoed ceiling like something coming apart under pressure. Perspiration was visible on his forehead. His custom velvet tuxedo was pulling at the seams. "You are a pathetic, broke accountant who is attempting to destroy my life because your own is a miserable, failed experiment. You think these papers mean anything to anyone in this room? I am a technology billionaire. My company is on the threshold of a transformative public offering. You cannot touch me. You are nothing." He pointed the microphone at the crowd of investors edging steadily toward the exits and swept his arm across the room with the dramatic, unhinged energy of a man who has lost his grip on the performance but cannot yet admit it. This morning, the most powerful venture capital firm on Wall Street, Apex Holdings, wired $5 million in liquid capital directly into my accounts. They backed my vision. They vetted my numbers. I have millions available to me right now, and I will use every cent of it to crush you and everything you claim to have built. Desmond gripped the silver microphone until the whites of his knuckles were visible. He paced the stage, breathing in ragged bursts, his athletic frame trembling with the effort of projecting dominance he no longer possessed. He pointed at the crowd of investors who continued their quiet, inexorable movement toward the exit, commanding them with increasingly desperate authority to stay and ignore the irrefutable documentation sitting open on their dinner tables. Then he turned the microphone toward my face and launched into a final, escalating inventory of my supposed failures. The miserable bookkeeper, the pathetic single mother, the woman who spent her life crouched over ledgers while men like him built empires. Madison, hearing the name of a Wall Street institution invoked with such force and authority, found a sudden, borrowed burst of toxic courage in the association. She dragged herself upright from where she had been crumbling, wiped the cascading mascara from her cheeks with the back of one hand, and straightened her spine with the particular rigid, brittle pride of someone whose self-image depends entirely on the status of the people standing next to her. She marched to the edge of the stage, lifted her chin to its most imperious angle, and glared at me with the full concentrated weight of a lifetime of practiced contempt. She informed the remaining guests in a carrying, theatrical voice that I was nothing but a cheap, bitter, failed accountant who occupied a cramped apartment and had spent her entire adult life resenting her sister's superiority. She constructed a rapid, hysterical narrative in which I was a deranged, obsessive, single mother who had crossed an ocean purely to sabotage her fairy tale wedding out of lifelong pathological jealousy. She invoked Desmond's backing by the most powerful financial institution in New York as proof that my stack of printed documents was legally and morally worthless against the unlimited capital of a certified tech visionary. She demanded that the chateau security physically remove me from the building and deposit me in the Parisian streets, where she had always believed someone of my station belonged. I stood perfectly still under the blazing stage lights. I listened to every word of their performance with the calm, unhurried attention of someone who has been waiting for exactly this moment for a very long time. I studied their sweat-drenched faces, their panicked eyes, the barely controlled hysteria vibrating beneath every syllable. And then I did the single thing neither of them had any framework to prepare for. I threw my head back and laughed. A full, genuine, richly resonant laugh that rose from somewhere entirely unafraid and filled the upper reaches of the ballroom with a sound that was the precise opposite of nervousness. It was the sound of a predator watching its prey step, of their own free will, directly onto a landmine. The laugh faded. Madison's manufactured bravado evaporated on contact with it. She realized, with a visible, physical jolt of disorientation, that my laughter was not a defense mechanism or a nervous deflection. It was the expression of someone who has been holding the winning hand since before she arrived. I walked toward Desmond with slow, measured steps. He took an involuntary step backward, his considerable frame instinctively registering the shift in the room's power. I did not reach for the microphone. I simply extended my open hand and waited with complete, unhurried stillness. The sheer, undiluted authority of my presence settled over him like a physical weight, and he surrendered the microphone without another word, his chest still heaving, his hands trembling, his eyes searching my face for something he was not going to find. I placed the microphone near my lips and looked out at the remaining guests, silent now, and watching with the fixed, wide-eyed attention of people who understand they are witnessing something consequential. Then I reached into my custom emerald handbag with one hand. I did not produce another bank statement. I withdrew a thick, substantial legal document bound in heavy black leather, bearing the official gold-embossed seal of the state of New York. Not a copy, the original master contract. I held it up for the entire ballroom to see clearly before I spoke. "Desmond," I said, my voice carrying with the calm, lethal finality of a sentence being read aloud. "You are absolutely right about one specific thing. Apex Holdings is, without question, the most ruthless and capable venture capital firm currently operating on Wall Street. And they did wire you exactly $5 million this morning." I paused for precisely one breath. "But you were so thoroughly blinded by your own greed, so completely desperate to secure immediate cash to fund these white orchids and this vintage champagne, that you made a catastrophic and entirely unforced error. You failed to read the predatory personal liability clauses buried in the emergency lending agreement you signed in that glass conference room. You signed without reading. And what you signed was not a bridge loan for your company." Desmond stared at the black leather document in my hand. His arrogant mask did not simply slip, it shattered, replaced by a dawning, spreading, sickening horror that moved visibly across his face in real time. He began to tremble. His breath hitched audibly in his throat as the full implications of his own blind signature began to assemble themselves into a picture he could no longer avoid. I opened the folder to its final page with deliberate, unhurried hands. I held it outward, turning it to face him, forcing him to look at the dense legal clauses he had dismissed without reading. I explained to the audience, still, silent, entirely captivated, that the agreement Desmond had signed was structured as a strictly personal liability obligation. I detailed the specific clauses stating that upon any finding of Securities and Exchange Commission investigation, Ponzi scheme operation, or financial fraud of any kind, the lending firm retained unilateral, immediate authority to seize total operational control of his company, liquidate every personal asset he possessed, and hold him fully and personally, criminally liable for all resulting legal penalties and federal financial deficits. Desmond made a sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite a word. A choked, suffocated exhalation of someone whose last exit has just been sealed. He reached out with trembling fingers toward the document. My security team stepped forward with measured precision, blocking his path without drama or unnecessary force. I held the contract perfectly still. "But that is not the most significant element, Desmond," I said softly into the microphone, my voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom with the intimacy of something spoken in a very small room. "I want you to look very carefully at the bottom right corner of this final page. I want you to find the authorization line, the line signed by the executive who personally approved your $5 million execution order." I raised one finger and tapped the ink signature resting directly above the printed title, Chief Executive Officer. "Did you not take the time to read the name of the person who approved your funding, Desmond?" I asked, my voice dropping to something just above a whisper, quiet enough that the silence of the room carried it to everyone. "My name is Caroline. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings. I am the Wall Street institution you have been bragging about to this room for the past hour. I did not wire you $5 million as a bailout to save your fraudulent company. I held the document steady and met his eyes without blinking. I purchased the exclusive legal right to foreclose on your entire existence. Desmond stared at the signature. He recognized the precise, elegant handwriting immediately. It was identical to the signature on the bank statements I had placed on my father's plate at Easter dinner. The final and absolute truth descended on his narcissistic self-conception with the weight and finality of a collapsing building. The woman he had mocked across a country club table, the single mother he had tried to humiliate in front of her family, the broke accountant he had thrown a check at with casual contempt. She was the apex predator who now legally owned his entire life, and she had orchestrated every single step of this with deliberate, patient precision. The realization broke him at a physiological level. His eyes lost focus. His knees buckled in sequence. Desmond collapsed onto the hard marble floor of the stage, landing directly at my feet. A ruined man, brought down entirely by the architecture of his own greed. Desmond remained crumpled on the polished marble, his breath arriving in shallow, ragged intervals. The crushing totality of the $5 million trap I had constructed with such meticulous patience had finally snapped whatever remained of his structural integrity. He stared blankly at my diamond heels with the hollow, searching expression of someone still trying, against all available evidence, to locate a loophole that had never been written into the document he signed. Madison stood motionless a few feet away, her extravagant silk gown transformed by the night's events from bridal masterpiece to something closer to a tragic costume. She looked at the man she had believed was her billionaire savior, prone on a French chateau floor with handcuff marks forming in his future, and then shifted her gaze upward to me with an expression of slowly dawning, genuinely devastating comprehension. The golden child was processing, for what appeared to be the first time in her adult life, that the sister she had mocked and diminished and excluded at every available opportunity had been, all along, the architect of everything she had always wanted to be. Richard and Patricia pressed together against the catering buffet table as though the physical proximity of each other's bodies offered some last available protection. They had lost their home, their country club membership, their social standing, and their fabricated identity within a span of days. Now the final component of their escape plan, a wealthy son-in-law who could absorb their legal and financial catastrophe with his surplus capital, was dissolving before them on a marble floor in France. There was nothing left. The sum of their calculated cruelties, their years of comfortable lies, their willingness to steal from a dying grandchild, had returned to them all at once, with interest. The remaining European socialites and venture capitalists who had not yet departed the ballroom began to murmur with escalating urgency. Disgust and outrage moved through the crowd with the particular virulence of people who have been made complicit in something they find genuinely offensive. They were elite predators by professional formation, and they reserved their most concentrated contempt for the specific category of person who tries to fraudulently infiltrate the ranks they had worked, or inherited their way, into. Desmond snapped out of his paralysis in a single, sudden movement, propelled by the primal, overriding instinct for self-preservation that surfaces when every other option has been closed. He scrambled upright, his custom suit jacket twisted badly off one shoulder, his eyes moving in rapid, darting arcs around the ballroom. The calculation was visible on his face, measuring the distance to the exits, assessing the positions of my security team, calculating what remained of his options. He did not address Madison. He did not acknowledge my parents. He turned and ran in a dead, full-speed sprint toward the Grand Oak exit doors at the far end of the ballroom, scattering guests from his path, toppling a towering crystal vase of white orchids that exploded across the marble in a cascade of water and broken glass, shouldering past a terrified waiter who stumbled sideways into a linen-covered serving station. He had severely, fatally miscalculated the operational scope of my preparation. My security team had sealed every viable exit point in the chateau with the systematic thoroughness of professionals who do not leave gaps. As Desmond reached the heavy oak doors and threw his full weight against them, expecting to burst out into the open courtyard and disappear into the generous anonymity of Paris at night, he collided instead with a solid wall of trained human resistance. Two former Special Operations agents materialized from the shadows flanking the doorway, arms crossed, feet planted at shoulder width, occupying the frame with the calm, immovable authority of men who have never needed to raise their voices to end a situation. Desmond screamed at them with the cracking, desperate register of a man who has just realized his last door is closed. He pushed against the nearest agent's chest with both hands, pouring whatever physical force he had remaining into the attempt. The agent did not move. He looked at Desmond with the mild, professional patience of someone dealing with a minor inconvenience, placed one large hand flat against Desmond's sternum, and pushed him backward with a single, unhurried motion that sent him stumbling several steps back into the center of the ballroom, as though gravity had simply reasserted its preferences. Before Desmond could process a new direction or a revised strategy, the sound reached the room from outside, distant at first, then growing with rapid, unmistakable urgency, the distinct, high-pitched, ascending wail of European law enforcement vehicles closing distance at speed. The sound grew louder with every second, bouncing off the ancient stone exterior walls of the estate, pressing in through the glass terraces with the insistence of something that cannot be outrun or redirected. Red and blue emergency lights strobed violently through the floor-to-ceiling windows, washing the faces of Madison and my parents in a harsh, rhythmic, unflattering illumination that stripped away every remaining pretense and revealed nothing but fear. The grand oak doors were pushed open from the outside with controlled, authoritative force. My private security team stepped aside with practiced deference, creating a clear corridor. A tactical unit from the French Economic Police entered the ballroom in formation, their boots striking the marble with the metronomic, echoing precision of people who have rehearsed this exact movement. They were followed immediately by two plainclothes agents in dark clothing who produced federal badges with the specific, unhurried economy of motion that signals absolute jurisdictional confidence. The coordination between the International Financial Crimes Division and American federal authorities had been, in execution, a flawless operation. They did not pause to survey the room. They did not hesitate to consult their documentation. They moved in a direct, unbroken line toward the center of the space with the purposeful inevitability of something that was always going to happen. Something I had simply ensured would happen here, in this room, in front of this audience, at this precise moment. Desmond backed away, both hands raised in a gesture of simultaneous surrender and theatrical protestation, his mouth producing a rapid, incoherent stream of words about misunderstandings and corporate procedures and the availability of his attorneys. The lead federal agent stepped forward and silenced him with a single, carried sentence, pronouncing Desmond's full legal name in a voice calibrated to reach every corner of the room, then announcing that he was being placed under immediate arrest pursuant to an active international warrant. The agent then enumerated the charges in the same projecting, deliberate tone. $50 million in international securities fraud, systematic money laundering across multiple jurisdictions, and deliberate flight from a federal subpoena. Madison's shriek cut across the room at a frequency that could have damaged crystal. She lunged forward and grabbed the arm of the nearest tactical officer, screaming that they were making a catastrophic mistake, that her fiancé was a legitimate and internationally recognized technology entrepreneur with legal representation in multiple countries. A female officer caught Madison firmly by both shoulders, turned her with practiced efficiency, and warned her in crisp, unapologetic English to stand back immediately or face immediate obstruction charges. Madison collapsed backward into Patricia's arms, dissolving into loud, heaving sobs as every component of the fairy tale she had constructed for herself was systematically and publicly dismantled before her eyes. The lead federal agent secured Desmond's wrists behind his back. The handcuffs closed with a clean, metallic double click that was extraordinarily audible in the silence of the ballroom, a sound that seemed to carry its own particular kind of finality. Desmond did not resist. He hung his head forward with the complete physical deflation of someone whose performance is permanently, irreversibly over. He was handcuffed and subdued in front of the assembled gathering of European high society that he had spent months cultivating and manipulating, the precise audience he had most needed to believe in his performance of success. The aristocratic guests and venture capitalists had absorbed more than enough. The illusion was not merely damaged, it had been systematically and documentably demolished, and the specific nature of the crimes involved made proximity to it a professional liability none of them were willing to absorb. In a display of synchronized, wordless rejection, the assembled elite set down their crystal champagne flutes on the nearest available surfaces, gathered their coats and designer bags with the crisp efficiency of people executing a prior decision, and moved toward the exits in a single, unified, silent wave of departure. No goodbyes were offered, no sympathy was extended. They simply removed themselves from the wreckage with the clean, unsentimental decisiveness of people who can afford to. The million-dollar destination wedding officially ceased to exist. The French authorities escorted the handcuffed chief executive officer of Nexus Tech Solutions through the main entrance, the alternating flash of blue emergency lights crossing his face in steady, unsparing intervals as he was guided toward the waiting vehicles. I remained where I stood on the grand stage, perfectly still, watching the operation complete itself with the quiet satisfaction of seeing something work exactly as designed. The trap had closed without a single component failing. The destruction was comprehensive, witnessed, and permanent. The piercing wail of the police sirens climbed briefly, then faded with disciplined gradualism into the cold Parisian night, leaving behind a silence so complete and so absolute that it felt structural, as though it had weight and mass of its own. The grand ballroom of the Château de Villers, which 60 minutes prior had been animated by the cultivated conversation of several hundred elite guests and the polished sound of a live string orchestra, had become something that felt less like a room and more like an aftermath. Half-consumed crystal champagne flutes stood abandoned across the white linen tables like monuments to a party that had stopped believing in itself. A toppled centerpiece of imported white orchids lay crushed against the marble floor, their petals scattered in water and broken glass. The orchestra's chairs stood empty, music stands still, holding the sheets of a piece that would not be finished. The wealthy guests had departed with a collective, synchronized efficiency that left no residue of warmth. I remained on the elevated stage, entirely composed, looking down at what the evening had produced. Madison was on the floor of the ballroom, her extravagant, hand-beaded designer gown absorbing a spreading mixture of spilled wine and water from the shattered floral arrangements. She was crying with the violent, full-body abandon of someone who has lost not just a plan, but an entire constructed identity. Deep, heaving sobs broken by gasps, her immaculate contour makeup drawing dark lines down her face with the candid honesty of something that cannot be retouched. The billionaire prince she had displayed to every person she knew had been escorted out of the building in federal restraints, and the fairy tale she had been narrating to herself since the engagement announcement had been dissolved in the span of an hour, in front of the audience she had most needed it to impress. Richard and Patricia stood motionless near the catering buffet, pressed together with the hollow, ashen stillness of people in shock. The confidence, the rehearsed authority, the elaborate performance of wealth and social consequence that had defined how they moved through the world for decades, all of it was gone, and what remained was simply two frightened, aging people standing in a French castle they had purchased access to with stolen money, staring at consequences they had genuinely not believed would arrive. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom opened once more. It was not the authorities. A sharply dressed man in a dark suit entered at a purposeful stride. The estate manager of the chateau, flanked by two substantial French security guards who positioned themselves with the practiced authority of people accustomed to handling situations that have gone expensively wrong. The estate manager's expression was not one of sympathy. His face was a mask of controlled professional fury, the expression of someone representing an institution of considerable historical reputation that has just hosted a federal arrest at its rehearsal dinner. He did not offer a greeting. He did not acknowledge the emotional chaos still operating at floor level. He walked directly toward my parents, a leather payment folio held open in both hands, and announced in crisp, unaccented English that the chateau had been formally notified of Desmond's international arrest. He enumerated the outstanding balance with the precision of someone who is prepared for this exact conversation. The disruption to the event, the physical damage sustained by the historic ballroom, including the shattered crystal, the ruined floral arrangements, and the water damage to the marble, and the full premium cost of the exorbitant hospitality services Desmond had ordered throughout the afternoon and evening. The outstanding incidental balance requiring immediate settlement was $20,000. Payment was required within 5 minutes. In the absence of payment, he would contact the local gendarmerie to arrange the arrest of the remaining family members on charges of defrauding a luxury hospitality establishment. My father opened his mouth. No sound came out. He closed it again. He had no card to produce. He had no account to draw from. He had no wealthy son-in-law to invoke, no corporate connection to leverage, no fiction left that was capable of buying him even 5 additional minutes of false security. The estate manager watched him with the patient, entirely unmoved expression of someone who has seen every variety of wealthy person discover they are not as wealthy as they believed. The $20,000 was, of course, already available. It had been available since before I landed. I had ensured that every contingency of this evening had a designated resolution. But I remained where I stood on the stage for precisely 30 additional seconds, long enough for my parents to feel, fully and without insulation, the complete and unambiguous weight of having nothing, before I descended the marble steps, produced the necessary settlement from my own account with one brief phone call to my wealth manager, and watched the estate manager close the folio with the brisk efficiency of a man returning to more dignified business. The evening was concluded. Every account had been settled. Every debt had been collected in the currency it was owed. Madison let out a wretched, heaving wail and seized the ruined hem of her gown with both fists. She shrieked at the estate manager that her fiancé was a technology mogul of international standing and that his corporate card on file would cover every outstanding charge without difficulty. The manager regarded her with the particular variety of aristocratic disgust that only a man who has managed a 17th-century French chateau for 20 years can produce. The expression of someone watching a poorly performed scene in a venue that deserves better. He informed her in precisely measured tones that Desmond's corporate card had been flagged as a fraudulent instrument and frozen by international banking authorities more than an hour prior. The card was entirely, irrevocably worthless. Patricia stepped forward with the desperate, brittle resolve of a woman who has one card left to play and knows it. She lifted her chin and attempted to project the imperious, suffocating confidence she had weaponized against restaurant staff and country club waiters for the better part of 4 decades. She produced a small, unconvincing laugh, the kind calibrated to suggest that reasonable people can resolve reasonable misunderstandings, and told the manager this was clearly a catastrophic banking error that would be sorted out within hours. She reached into her designer handbag and produced her premium platinum credit card with the unhurried confidence of someone who has never once been told no by a payment terminal. The manager did not smile. He produced a mobile payment terminal from his jacket pocket and inserted the card with clinical efficiency. The machine processed for exactly 3 seconds. Then it emitted a loud, flat, unambiguous electronic tone. Declined. The color left Patricia's face. She snatched the card back and dug into her wallet with escalating, barely suppressed panic, producing a gold travel rewards card and extending it with slightly less composed hands. The manager swiped it without expression. The machine beeped again. Declined. Patricia's breathing began to arrive in short, audible bursts. She looked at Richard with the wide, terrified eyes of someone who has just realized the floor beneath them is not actually there, and she told him to fix it immediately. Richard, sweating through his expensive tuxedo in a way that would have mortified him 6 hours earlier, reached into his jacket and produced his own heavy metal black card. The very card I had been secretly paying off for 5 consecutive years before I cut the financial cord at Easter dinner. He handed it to the manager with a hand that was not entirely steady. The manager swiped it. A third harsh, conclusive beep rang through the empty ballroom. Declined. The estate manager's expression solidified into something that went beyond disdain. It became the professionally detached face of a man executing a protocol he is prepared for. He returned the terminal to his pocket with the unhurried precision of someone who is never in a hurry, because the situation always resolves in his institution's favor. He signaled to his flanking security guards with a slight nod, and they took a single, coordinated step forward. He informed my parents that they had exactly 2 minutes to produce a valid form of currency, cash, active card, or bank transfer, or they would be escorted without further discussion directly into the back of a French police vehicle currently idling in the chateau's front courtyard. The brutal simplicity of the ultimatum finally shattered the last intact panel of their delusion. They had absolutely nothing. I had frozen every account, every line of credit, every emergency fund and supplementary card connected to their names. They were standing inside a 17th-century French castle on foreign soil, thousands of miles from home, with zero liquid capital and a $20,000 hospitality debt they had no earthly means of servicing. Madison ceased performing and simply broke. She dropped to the marble floor and began weeping with the raw, entirely unguarded abandon of someone who has nothing left to protect. She rocked backward and forward, clutching the soiled tulle of her ruined gown, wailing that her life was finished. And for once in her adult life, she was not exaggerating. Patricia pressed both hands over her face, sobbing with the specific, desperate quality of someone who can see the walls of a foreign prison cell beginning to take shape in their immediate future. Richard stood very still for a long moment, staring at the security guards with the hollow expression of a man watching the last piece of the world he understood disappear. Then he turned his gaze slowly upward toward the grand stage. He looked at me, the arrogant patriarch, the man who had called me a failure and a freeloader and a source of shame at every available opportunity, who had evicted me from his emotional life as casually as one discards a broken piece of furniture, who had allowed his wife to forge his granddaughter's signature and drain a child's surgical fund. Finally, completely broke. Not the performative, weaponized breaking he had deployed in my lobby to manipulate my security staff. Something deeper and more permanent. His pride, his unearned superiority, his lifelong insistence on being the most important person in any room, all of it crumbled into something fine and irretrievable. He walked toward the stage on unsteady legs, each step carrying the visible weight of total, irrevocable ruin. When he reached the base of the marble steps, he did the single thing I had genuinely never, in 33 years of knowing him, believed I would witness. Richard dropped to his knees. The sound of his bones striking the hard marble floor resonated through the empty ballroom with a finality that felt almost architectural. He looked up at me from below, tears tracking freely down his aged face, his hands pressed together in a gesture of complete and absolute submission that he had never made to any person in his life. He begged, he pleaded in a voice stripped of every defense mechanism, a broken, barely audible whisper, for me to pay the $20,000 so they would not be left to rot in a French jail cell. He asked me, openly and without any remaining trace of dignity, to show them mercy. He begged me to purchase the cheapest economy seats available on the first flight back to New York so they could go home and face their bankruptcy on familiar ground. He swore, with the desperate conviction of a man who has nothing left to bargain with but promises, that he would do anything I asked if I simply saved them one final time. I stood perfectly still at the very edge of the stage. The light from the crystal chandeliers caught the diamonds at my throat and scattered it across the marble below. I looked down at the weeping, kneeling man who had thrown me away. I looked at my mother, folded in on herself in the middle of the floor. I looked at my sister, surrounded by the wreckage of her manufactured fairy tale. They were entirely, completely at my mercy, not because I had placed them there, but because they had marched themselves to this exact spot, step by calculated step, over years of cruelty and willful blindness. I did not say a word. I simply stood there, at the absolute apex of the world they had spent 3 decades insisting I was not good enough to inhabit, and let the silence do what silence does. Richard remained on his knees with his head bowed and his shoulders shaking. Patricia, registering that her husband's prostrate begging had not immediately produced financial rescue, made the decision to deploy her oldest and most thoroughly rehearsed weapon. She dragged herself up from the cold floor with visible effort and stumbled toward the foot of the steps. She looked up at me with wide, tear-filled eyes and assembled on her face the expression of a desperate, loving mother on the very edge of losing everything. She clasped her hands together at her chest, her knuckles white with tension, and began to speak in a voice calibrated with theatrical precision to evoke maternal fragility. "Caroline, please," she whimpered, her voice fracturing on each syllable in exactly the way she had practiced over decades of emotional manipulation. "You have made your point. You have demonstrated your power and your success beyond any possible doubt. We are completely humiliated. We have lost absolutely everything. Is that not sufficient? Is that not enough? We are stranded in a foreign country with no resources and no one to turn to. You cannot leave us here to face the French authorities." She pressed her clasped hands harder against her chest. "I carried you for 9 months. I raised you under my roof, despite our flaws and our mistakes. And we have made terrible mistakes. We are still your parents. Madison is still your sister. At the end of every day, we are blood. You have to help us. Blood means you never abandon your own family. You simply do not." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the invocation hit me with the particular force of something that is simultaneously absurd and genuinely offensive. Blood. She stood before me in a French chateau paid for with money stolen from her dying grandson and asked me to honor the sanctity of blood. I took a single, deliberate step forward, bringing myself to the very edge of the stage and closing the vertical distance between us until she was forced to look directly up into my face. "Blood," I repeated, my voice dropping to something that was not quite a whisper, but carried further than a shout in the stillness of the empty ballroom. You want to talk about blood, Patricia? Then let us talk about it with the specific honesty it deserves. Let us talk about the blood moving through the defective heart of your 7-year-old grandson. Let us talk about how you walked into a private banking branch, looked a bank teller directly in the eye, and forged my signature to drain his surgical fund. You did not think about blood when you stole $150,000 from a dying child so you could drink vintage champagne and eat imported truffles in a 17th century French castle. You thought about your country club membership. You thought about your aristocratic performance. You thought about whether the flower arrangements were sufficiently impressive for the investors you were trying to impress. Blood was entirely irrelevant to you until it became the only argument you had left. Patricia flinched backward as though physically burned. Her mouth opened and a shaking denial began to form, the same reflexive denial that had insulated her from consequences her entire adult life. It was just a temporary loan, she stammered, her voice unraveling in real time. We were going to replace every penny immediately after the wedding, once Desmond's company went public and returned the investment. We never meant to cause Leo any harm. We never. Desmond is a convicted international fraudster. I cut across her words with a voice like a door closing. There was no public offering. There was no investment return. There was no plan that didn't require stealing from a child. I held her gaze without any visible effort. You stood in my home and told me to stay there and hide my son so he wouldn't embarrass you in front of high society. You telephoned Child Protective Services and attempted to have my child removed from my custody, not because you believed he was in danger, but because I turned off your luxury credit cards. You did not view me as blood, Patricia. You viewed me as an automated teller machine that was occasionally inconvenient. And now that the machine is permanently decommissioned, you have suddenly and conveniently remembered that we share DNA. Richard looked up from the floor, his face a landscape of smeared tears and spent pride. His expensive tuxedo was ruined beyond any professional recovery. We will pay it back, Caroline, he said, his voice carrying the hollow, desperate quality of a man reading from a script he knows no one will believe. We will do whatever it takes. We will spend the rest of our lives making this right. Just clear the $20,000 with the estate manager so we don't go to a European prison. Buy us the cheapest tickets home. We will work it off. Every cent. Please. Don't leave us here. I looked at the estate manager, standing with his payment folio and his measured professional contempt, his security guards at precise attention beside him. Then I looked back down at the 3 people who had constructed their entire adult identities on the premise that I was worth less than they were. I reached into my custom emerald evening bag. I did not produce my heavy metal card. I did not reach for a checkbook. I reached into the side compartment and withdrew exactly 3 crisp $100 bills, held together by nothing but proximity. I extended my hand over the edge of the stage and opened my fingers. The 3 bills separated in the air and drifted downward in unhurried, independent arcs, green against the candlelit marble, until they settled one by one on the polished floor directly beside Richard's trembling knees. There is $300, I announced, my voice carrying to every corner of the empty ballroom with absolute clarity. That is precisely enough to cover a taxi ride from this chateau to Charles de Gaulle Airport. As for the $20,000 balance you currently owe this estate manager, I would strongly recommend you introduce yourselves to the catering kitchen without delay. You are welcome to wash the dishes, scrub the marble floors, and polish the silver until you have accounted for every single cent of your vanity project. I understand the chateau has considerable silver. Madison released a sound that was less a scream and more a primal expression of total annihilation. She lurched forward on her knees and began tearing at the delicate tulle of her designer gown with both hands, wailing in a voice of pure, operatic agony. I am wearing haute couture, she shrieked, her voice cracking across its upper register. "I cannot wash dishes. I was supposed to be a billionaire's wife. This cannot be happening. You cannot do this to me." Patricia collapsed back onto the cold marble and clutched her chest with both hands as a full physiological panic attack overtook what remained of her composure. Richard simply stared at the 3 bills resting near his knees, $300 on the floor of a chateau he had consumed $150,000 of stolen money to access, and said absolutely nothing because there was absolutely nothing left to say. I did not stay to watch them disintegrate further. I had already seen everything I needed to see, and I had no appetite for prolonged suffering, only for complete and final conclusions. I turned my back on my biological family for the last time in my life. I walked across the grand stage with deliberate composure, my diamond heels clicking their familiar rhythm against the marble. I descended the side staircase and moved in a straight line past the estate manager, who received, as I passed, a discreet nod from my assistant confirming that the $20,000 balance would be settled within the hour through a corporate transfer from one of my holding entities because the chateau had done nothing wrong and deserved to be made whole. And past his security guards, and past the overturned floral arrangements and the abandoned crystal, and the entire magnificent wreckage of the evening, I did not look back. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped into the crisp Parisian night. The air was cold and extraordinarily clean, the kind of air that feels like a correction after a long period of breathing something stale. My private security detail materialized immediately on both sides, matching my pace down the illuminated gravel path toward the waiting Maybach. My driver opened the reinforced rear door and I settled into the leather interior, smoothing the skirt of my emerald gown with both hands. "Take me to the private airstrip," I said, looking out through the tinted glass at the ancient stone of the chateau receding behind us as the engine engaged. "We are leaving Paris tonight." The armored vehicle pulled away from the Château de Villers at an unhurried, even pace, carrying me steadily away from the burning wreckage of everything my toxic family had constructed and everything they had tried to take from me. I poured a single glass of sparkling water from the refrigerated minibar and took one long, slow, thoroughly satisfying sip. The war was officially concluded. The outcome was absolute and unconditional. I was returning to New York, to my son, to my empire, and to the real, beautiful, fully realized life that was waiting for me. The one I had built entirely by myself, without any of their help or their permission. Exactly 7 days had passed since I walked out of that 17th century castle and left my toxic family to the consequences they had spent years accumulating. I was back in the secure sanctuary of my Manhattan penthouse, breathing the crisp, hospital-grade filtered air of a space designed with genuine love and genuine purpose, air that had always been clean for Leo, and that now felt simply like the atmosphere of a life that had resolved into something right. Leo was resting comfortably under the attentive care of his private medical team, entirely insulated from the international implosion of the grandparents who had tried to steal his surgical fund and the consequences that had followed. I sat in my home office reviewing the latest quarterly reports for Apex Holdings, numbers that told a story of a firm operating with extraordinary precision when my secure phone rang. Harrison. His voice carried the particular quality I had come to associate with a man who has finished something difficult and done it exceptionally well. He informed me that Flight 408 from Paris had just touched down at John F. Kennedy International Airport. Richard, Patricia, and Madison had somehow survived a week of what I understood to be genuine, unromantic, physically demanding indentured servitude in the chateau's kitchen and maintenance operations. They had scrubbed marble floors, washed dishes until their formerly manicured hands developed blisters, and polished silverware until they had discharged enough of the outstanding balance for the French authorities to arrange their deportation back to the United States on the most economical commercial flight available. They had crossed the Atlantic in middle seats, but their nightmare was not concluding with their return to American soil. It was, as I had carefully ensured, only just beginning in earnest. Harrison had arranged for a private investigator to document the exact moment of their arrival. I opened the encrypted video file on my terminal. The footage was high definition and entirely unsparing. I watched as Richard and Patricia shuffled through the sliding glass doors of the International Arrivals Terminal looking like people who had been somewhere very unpleasant for longer than they had expected. Their designer clothes, the carefully maintained armor of their social performance, were soiled and compressed from a week of hard use and a transatlantic flight with no room to breathe. They dragged behind them luggage that was no longer the kind that signals anything desirable. Their faces were pale and deeply sunken in a way that spoke not of jet lag, but of something more fundamental that had been consumed and had not yet been replenished. They believed they were finally safe. They believed they could quietly reinsert themselves into their former life and begin the long, slow work of rebuilding the narrative. They did not make it to the baggage carousel. 4 federal agents in dark windbreakers materialized directly into their path with the unhurried, inevitable quality of people who have been waiting without impatience. They did not offer greetings. They produced badges and moved immediately into formation around my parents. I watched as the lead agent read them their rights in a voice calibrated to carry across the arrivals terminal, loud enough for the surrounding travelers with their rolling suitcases and their welcome home placards to hear every charge clearly and completely. He stated that Richard and Patricia were being placed under federal arrest for felony wire fraud, grand larceny, and the malicious embezzlement of a minor's medical trust fund. Patricia's suitcase fell from her hand, and she collapsed sideways into the restraining arms of an agent, screaming hysterically in a way that cleared a significant radius of bystanders. The agent pulled her arms behind her back with practiced efficiency and secured the handcuffs with the mechanical finality of something that has been prepared for a long time. Richard did not struggle. He stood with his arms at his sides and a blank, forward-looking expression on his face as the cold steel closed around his wrists, the expression of a man who has run out of ways to not understand what is happening to him. The man who had spent the entirety of his conscious adult life obsessing over the flawless architecture of his high society image was being perp-walked through a crowded international airport terminal in handcuffs, in soiled clothes, past strangers with phones, past families reuniting, past a life that was continuing without him at its center. The red and blue lights of the federal vehicles waiting outside pulsed through the arrival hall's glass frontage and lit his face in rhythmic, alternating intervals all the way to the door. I closed the video file and took a measured sip of my espresso. The coffee was excellent. While they were being processed and fingerprinted at the federal detention facility, Harrison and I initiated the final phase of their property liquidation with the seamless efficiency of a closing procedure that had been fully prepared for weeks. The 30-day eviction notice I had formally served at Easter dinner had expired during their time abroad. I authorized the county sheriff to execute the final lockout order on the suburban estate. The authorities arrived at the property with heavy padlocks and bright yellow notices and sealed every door and window in sequence, officially returning total physical possession of the mansion to my real estate holding firm. The house that had been my parents' primary prop, the stage set for their entire performance of generational success, was now simply one of my investment properties awaiting disposition. When Richard and Patricia were released the following evening on a heavily conditioned bail arrangement, they had nowhere to go. Their credit infrastructure had been seized. Their bank accounts were frozen pending the federal investigation. Their country club had blacklisted them with a thoroughness that left no ambiguity. Their former allies, the men whose debts I had acquired and who had turned on Richard with such savage speed at Oakwood, were not available for appeals to old friendship. With no viable alternative, the former high society patriarch and his wife of decades dragged their remaining possessions in garbage bags to a dilapidated motel on the worst outskirts of the city. The precise category of accommodation they had spent their entire lives performing their superiority over. They were renting by the week, paying with bills begged from distant relatives who were still processing what had happened, sleeping in a room that bore no resemblance to any room they had ever previously occupied. The absolute finest development in the extended aftermath, however, belonged to Madison. The Golden Child had avoided federal arrest at the airport because she had not been a signatory on the stolen medical trust documents, a technicality that spared her handcuffs but offered no protection from the thing that destroyed her more thoroughly than any prison sentence could have. The international press had covered Desmond's Paris arrest with the enthusiastic appetite that financial crime stories receive when they involve a chateau, a wedding, and a $50 million Ponzi scheme. Madison's name and photograph had been distributed across every major financial publication, tabloid, and digital platform as the delusional bride who had stood on a stage in France defending a fraudster to his investors while federal agents walked through the door. The word aided appeared in several headlines. The word abetted appeared in others. She had lost her fiancé, her lifestyle, her social positioning, and, in the specific practical way that matters most, her employability. She made desperate applications to public relations firms across the city, hoping that the industry's professional appetite for narrative management might extend to hiring someone who had recently become one of its most prominent cautionary tales. It did not. Corporate recruiters reviewed her background check with the expression of people encountering something they would prefer not to touch, and her resume moved directly from inbox to shredder with a consistency that became its own kind of message. Nobody wanted to hire someone globally associated with federal fraud. She was, in the precise vocabulary of her industry, radioactive. Cornered and desperate and constitutionally incapable of accepting that her era of unearned privilege had concluded permanently, Madison made one final, spectacularly ill-considered decision. My executive assistant interrupted an afternoon strategy meeting to inform me, with a voice that was equal parts alarm and barely suppressed amusement, that a highly agitated, visibly disheveled woman was creating a significant disruption in the marble lobby of the Apex Holdings Tower on Wall Street. Madison had actually presented herself at my corporate headquarters, the building she had threatened to acquire and liquidate from a bridal boutique in Soho just weeks earlier. She had bypassed the secondary biometric security on the ground floor by the graceless method of following a group of visiting hedge fund managers through the barriers at close proximity, ridden the elevator to the executive suite, and was now standing in the center of the glass-walled bullpen outside my private office, weeping at considerable volume and demanding to speak with her sister. I stood up from my desk, smoothed the lapels of my tailored charcoal suit, walked to the heavy glass door of my office, and observed her for a measured moment before opening it. Madison was unrecognizable in the precise documentary sense of the word. The polished, imperious, permanently superior woman who had held court at Easter dinner and displayed her engagement ring for a room full of admirers had been replaced by something that wore her face and nothing else. Her designer wardrobe was gone. She was wearing an oversized sweater and leggings that had been washed enough times to lose their original color. Her hair was unwashed and gathered without care into a knot that had stopped serving its purpose some time ago. The cultivated aura of expensive, effortless superiority that had defined her entire adult presentation had simply ceased to exist, leaving behind a woman who looked frightened and exhausted and genuinely at a loss for the first time in her life. She was crying loudly enough that several of my senior financial analysts had stopped work and were observing her with the uncertain discomfort of people who did not sign on for this particular variety of workplace experience. When she saw me open the glass door, she lurched forward with both hands extended. My personal security detail stepped smoothly into position, and she struck the wall of them and crumpled to the polished granite floor. She did not demand anything. She did not issue ultimatums. She dropped every last fragment of her pride and simply begged, the kind of begging that has given up all attempts at dignity. "Caroline, please, you have to help me," Madison wailed, reaching both hands toward my shoes from the floor. "I have absolutely nothing. The press has annihilated me. Every public relations firm in the city has closed its doors to me because of Desmond's fraud. I cannot pay my rent. The bank is threatening to repossess my car. Give me a job. I will do anything. I will sort the mail. I will get coffee for your assistants. I will sweep the floors of this building if you give me a paycheck. Please. We are sisters. You cannot let me end up on the street." I stood perfectly still and let her words fill the high-ceilinged room without interrupting them. I did not reach down to help her up. I did not offer her a tissue or a chair or any gesture that might be mistaken for the opening of a negotiation. I looked at her with an expression of complete clinical detachment and let the silence run for several seconds after she finished speaking. She was performing victimhood with impressive commitment, positioning herself as an innocent casualty of Desmond's fraud and our parents' decisions, rewriting her own specific, documented, enthusiastic participation in every act of cruelty and humiliation I had endured as the passive, regrettable consequence of influences beyond her control. She needed me to forget. She was wagering everything on my willingness to forget. "You want a job in this building, Madison?" I asked, my voice cutting through her crying with the clean efficiency of something designed for exactly that purpose. She looked up with wide, rapidly nodding eyes. "I will work so hard, Caroline. I promise. Just give me a chance. We are family." I took one slow, deliberate step closer and looked directly into her face. "I am going to help you," I said, my voice dropping to the specific register I use when I want every word to land with maximum precision. "In exactly the same way you helped me." A visible shudder moved through her. She knew what was coming and could not stop it. Let us revisit Easter Sunday with some accuracy. When I asked a simple question about your wedding date, you told me, in front of our entire extended family, that I was a struggling, frumpy single mother who would ruin the aesthetic of your social performance. You told me to stay home and conceal my sick son, because a 7-year-old boy with a congenital heart defect would be an inconvenient burden on your luxury vacation. You looked at me and called me an embarrassing, broke sister who would likely beg your wealthy friends for charity at the reception. "Caroline, please," she began. "You laughed when our father told me I was a government assistance freeloader," I continued, not pausing. "You mocked my clothing. You attempted to have me publicly humiliated in front of everyone who shared our blood. You flew to Paris on money stolen directly from your nephew's heart surgery fund, posted photographs of yourself in first-class departures, and wrote a caption calling people like me peasants." I straightened to my full height and looked down at her with an expression entirely devoid of ambiguity. "You are not a victim, Madison. You are a greedy, calculating parasite who has simply run out of viable hosts. I do not employ people with rotten characters and criminal associations, and I do not provide second chances to individuals who spent years celebrating my suffering." Madison opened her mouth. I raised one hand and snapped my fingers once. The 2 security guards stepped forward, took her firmly by both arms, and raised her efficiently from the granite floor. She thrashed against their grip with the desperate, escalating energy of someone who cannot believe this is actually happening, screaming my name, alternating between demands and pleas with increasing incoherence as they moved her toward the executive elevators. Harrison stepped out of his adjacent office with the unhurried timing of a man who has been waiting for his cue. He walked up to Madison's struggling form without altering his pace and placed a thick, sealed manila envelope directly into her hands with the practiced neutrality of someone delivering a document rather than a verdict. "That is a permanent restraining order," I announced, watching the specific quality of terror that recognition produces move across her face as her fingers registered the weight of the envelope. "Signed by a state Supreme Court judge this morning. You are legally prohibited from coming within 500 feet of me, my son, my residence, or this corporate building. If you attempt to contact me by any means or set foot in this building again, you will be arrested and charged with violating a federal protection order without any further warning." Madison's scream when the elevator doors finally closed was the last sound she ever made in my presence. The heavy steel panels slid together and sealed it entirely from the floor. I stood in the quiet that followed for a moment, then turned around and walked back into my office, leaving the toxic remnants of my biological family permanently on the other side of that door. The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan has a particular quality of light on clear mornings, cold and direct and unsparing, the kind that illuminates things without flattering them. I walked up its wide marble steps flanked by Harrison and my security detail, wearing a tailored navy suit that communicated exactly what I intended it to communicate. Inside the grand courtroom, the atmosphere was suffocating in the particular way of large, formal spaces where the stakes of what is about to happen are understood by everyone present. Desmond occupied the first defense table in an orange institutional jumpsuit that provided, in the language of fabric and color, the most honest account of his situation that had yet been offered. The custom Italian suits, the velvet tuxedo, the performance of limitless success. All of it had been reduced to this single, unambiguous statement. At the second defense table, Richard and Patricia sat with the hollow, ashen quality of people who have been processing an unacceptable reality for long enough that it has simply become their new physiognomy. Their designer wardrobes had been replaced by cheap, off-the-rack clothing that fit imprecisely in the particular way of garments chosen under duress and financial constraint. They were visibly trembling as I took my seat in the front row, directly behind the federal prosecutors, without looking at them. The judge called the session to order with the terse efficiency of a man who runs a tight courtroom because he finds all other kinds wasteful. Desmond's case was addressed first. The prosecuting attorney laid out the architecture of his fraud with the methodical, devastating thoroughness of someone who has spent considerable time ensuring that every brick is mortared into place. $50 million, hundreds of defrauded angel investors. Years of deliberate, systematic deception executed with enough charisma and tailoring to forestall serious scrutiny for longer than it should have been possible. Desmond's defense attorney attempted the argument that his client was a genuinely visionary entrepreneur who had simply made a series of compounding errors under pressure, a misguided dreamer, not a predator. Harrison leaned across the aisle and handed the prosecutor the emergency loan contract Desmond had signed in my conference room. The prosecutor presented it to the judge with the quiet satisfaction of someone producing the document that ends the conversation. It established beyond any arguable doubt that Desmond had attempted to commit active, knowing fraud against a major Wall Street firm in the hours immediately before boarding a flight to Paris to continue defrauding the investors assembled at his rehearsal dinner. The judge looked at Desmond for a sustained moment with an expression that contained no component of leniency. The gavel came down with the sound of something final. 15 years in a federal penitentiary, no early parole. Desmond was immediately shackled and led through a side door, and the grand performance of his life was concluded. Madison was not present in the gallery to watch her invented billionaire prince receive his sentence. She was in a cheap sublet somewhere, hiding from a press that had already lost interest in her and from a world that had moved on with complete indifference. Then it was time for Richard and Patricia. Grand larceny, wire fraud, the malicious embezzlement of a minor's medical trust fund. The charges had a specific documentary clarity that left very little room for narrative. I was called to the witness stand. I walked up the wooden steps, took the oath with a steady hand and a level voice, settled into the chair, and looked directly and without hesitation at the two people who had brought me into the world. They could not meet my gaze. They stared at their shackled hands with the fixed attention of people for whom the alternative, looking at what they had made, was not something they could currently sustain. The defense attorney, a public defender assigned to them after their assets were frozen, made the best available argument with the materials provided, which were limited. He asked whether it was possible that my mother had genuinely believed she had some form of family authorization to access the funds for what she understood to be an urgent family purpose. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the unhurried, precise clarity of someone giving a deposition rather than a performance. I informed the court that the account in question was an irrevocable medical trust, a legal designation that exists specifically to prevent any access except for its designated medical purpose, regardless of who requests it or what circumstances they invoke. I placed before the court the original wire transfer authorization form bearing my forged signature. I walked through the documented sequence of events. Patricia entering a private banking branch, presenting herself as a distressed grandmother responding to a crisis involving her grandchild, and submitting a fraudulent emergency claim. Not because her grandson was in crisis, but because her daughter's money would otherwise be unavailable for a deposit on a French castle. The defense attorney opened his mouth. He looked at the documentation Harrison had assembled, a meticulous forensic timeline linking every dollar of the stolen funds to specific wedding expenditures. And he closed it again. He looked at his clients. He set his pen down quietly and returned to his seat, having reached the professional conclusion that there was nothing left to argue that the evidence would not immediately and humiliatingly disprove. The courtroom absorbed what it had heard in a silence that felt structural. A grandmother had stolen her dying grandson's heart surgery fund to pay for a wedding deposit. The facts were unambiguous, and the documentation was complete, and the silence that followed their presentation was the silence of people confronting something that does not improve with reflection. Richard and Patricia broke simultaneously and completely. Seeing their last available defense dissolve, they abandoned the dignity of the courtroom with the specific desperation of people who have no remaining options. The judge asked whether they had anything to say before sentencing was delivered. Patricia stood on legs that required both hands on the table to function and began to weep with the full, unmanaged abandon of genuine terror. She looked at me and begged, for the court, for the gallery, for anyone willing to listen, asking me to intervene, to tell the judge this had been a terrible mistake made by people who were frightened and overwhelmed and did not understand the consequences of what they were doing. She used the word family with the desperate, repetitive insistence of someone who has no other word left. Richard stood beside her and sobbed openly in a federal courtroom, in front of a judge and a gallery of strangers, and asked me to spare them from prison. They had lost their house, their friends, their standing, their dignity. Couldn't I tell the judge that was enough? Couldn't I tell him they would spend the rest of their lives making it right? I sat in the witness stand and looked at them with the complete, clinical stillness of someone who has already made peace with this moment. When the judge asked me whether I had a statement regarding sentencing, I turned to face him and stated clearly and without qualification that I requested the maximum financial penalty available under the applicable statutes. The judge nodded. He looked at Richard and Patricia with an expression that had no room in it for the sympathy they were performing toward. He called them to stand and face the bench and delivered a reprimand that was scathing in its specificity. a formal, judicial accounting of what they had done and what it represented. Not as a legal abstraction, but as a human failure of a particularly profound kind. Then he brought the gavel down with the weight of finality. Federal prison time was not imposed, on grounds of age and the absence of prior criminal records. The sentence was, in its own way, more comprehensive than incarceration. 5 years of strict federal probation, 2,000 hours of mandated community service, and the financial restitution, the instrument that would define the remainder of their natural lives, was set at double the stolen amount, $300,000, to be paid directly and in full into Leo's medical trust. With their assets seized, their earning capacity effectively destroyed by their new status as convicted felons, and their social network entirely dissolved, the only available path to satisfying that obligation was the one they would be walking for the rest of their lives. Minimum wage work, monthly payments, decades of quiet, invisible, unreported labor in exchange for the glamorous illusions they had chosen over their grandson's heart. They were stripped of their wealth, their social standing, their narrative of themselves, and every single thing they had ever valued or performed for the benefit of others. The empire of lies was officially concluded. I walked out of the courthouse into clear afternoon light and felt nothing complicated at all. 6 months passed, the kind of 6 months that feel like a longer distance than their calendar representation suggests, because of how much had moved in them. I sat in the sprawling rooftop garden of my Manhattan penthouse with my hands resting on the cool iron of the patio table, and I let the warm afternoon sun of a fully arrived spring do its work on my face without rushing it. What was unfolding in front of me was the finest thing I had ever seen. My son Leo was running across the manicured lawn of the terrace, not walking carefully, not pausing to manage his breath, not moving with the measured conservatism of a child who has learned that his body requires monitoring. He was sprinting with the completely uncalculated, full-commitment energy of a healthy 7-year-old boy who has just discovered that a soccer ball, kicked correctly at the right angle, can connect with a glass railing and produce a satisfying sound. The complex open-heart surgery at Mount Sinai had been, in the unanimous assessment of the surgical team, a complete and unmitigated success. The world-class pediatric cardiologists I had secured through his medical trust, the fund that had been stolen from and then restored and then tripled in its protected status, had repaired his congenital defect with a precision that still, 6 months later, produced in me something close to reverence when I thought about it. The oxygen concentrator was gone. The haunting, rhythmic hissing that had provided the background texture of our domestic life for years had been replaced by the sound of Leo laughing, a full, generous, entirely unguarded laugh that reached the corners of the terrace and kept going. I took a slow, deep breath of city air that tasted clean and specific and present, and I felt a peace settle into me that was not the absence of something difficult, but the positive presence of something that had been built and was now inhabiting its full dimensions. The glass door slid open. Harrison stepped into the sunlight in his signature charcoal suit, carrying a leather-bound financial portfolio with the unhurried confidence of a man who is looking forward to the numbers he is about to present. He walked to the table and placed the portfolio in front of me, then took the chair across from me and offered the rare, genuine smile of someone who has done something well and knows it. The quarterly reports for Apex Holdings were complete. The aggressive surgical dismantling of Nexus Tech Solutions had been executed with a precision that converted what had been, on paper, a $50 million federal fraud case into a staggering corporate profit. The viable assets, the hardware infrastructure, the commercial leases, all liquidated to the highest bidders with the methodical efficiency of a firm that knows exactly what it is doing. Harrison tapped the leather cover and told me that Apex Holdings had just recorded the single highest growth quarter in its operating history. I opened the dossier and reviewed the bottom line. The return was, as Harrison had suggested without quite stating it, extraordinary. Desmond's desperate attempt to scam my firm had, by the specific mechanism of the personal liability agreement he had signed without reading, inadvertently handed me the operational rights to a corporate salvage operation worth considerably more than the loan he had been seeking. He was sitting in a maximum security federal facility serving the first year of a 15-year sentence, while I was using the asset base of his collapsed fraud to expand my global portfolio. There was a certain symmetry to it that I found deeply satisfying. After Harrison returned to the office, I picked up my tablet and moved through the morning financial news with the relaxed attention of someone who is reviewing context rather than searching for threats. Market movements, emerging sectors, policy developments, the ordinary continuous conversation of the world I operated in. There was nothing about Richard and Patricia. The intense, momentarily consuming media cycle that had surrounded their airport arrest, their public humiliation, and the federal prosecution had completed its full rotation and moved on with complete institutional indifference. They were no longer a story. They were simply two aging convicted felons serving out a 5-year probation in the obscurity, that is, in practice, the most final verdict the world delivers. Through Harrison's legal network, I had received periodic, matter-of-fact updates on their circumstances. They were making the mandatory monthly payments on their $300,000 restitution obligation through the only mechanism available to them, exhausting, low-wage work of the specific kind that had always represented to them the clearest possible evidence of personal failure. The man who had benchmarked his identity against his golf handicap and his country club table was working in circumstances I did not need to investigate further to understand. The woman who had stolen from her dying grandson to fund champagne towers in a French castle was living in circumstances that no longer attracted any attention from anyone with resources or influence. Madison had disappeared into the city's vast, indifferent capacity for absorbing people who are no longer relevant. Stripped of her fabricated status, unemployable in the industry she had trained for and the one she had pivoted to, and associated in every searchable database with federal fraud and international money laundering, she had become invisible in the specific way that is different from obscurity. Not unknown, but actively avoided. I set the tablet face down on the iron table and picked up my porcelain cup. The Earl Grey was exactly the right temperature. I took a slow, deliberate sip and let the warmth of it settle before I looked out over the skyline. That particular, inexhaustible view of the city that had been the backdrop of my entire adult life, that had watched me build everything I had built and endure everything I had endured without offering any opinion either way. For 33 years, I had allowed those people to author my story. I had absorbed their assessments of my worth with the resignation of someone who believes that the people who know you first must know you best. I had endured their gaslighting and their conditional performances of love and their casual, consistent cruelty. Not because I lacked the capacity to resist, but because I had been told in 10,000 small and large ways that resistance was ingratitude. Leo kicked the soccer ball against the railing again. The sound it made was generous and full and entirely alive. I watched his face, flushed with exertion, lit with the specific pleasure of a body that has recently been given back to itself, laughing at something only he could see. And the last structural element of the weight I had been carrying dissolved so quietly that I almost missed it. The greatest, most permanent victory had not been the courtroom. It had not been the handcuffs at JFK or Desmond's collapse on a chateau floor, or the $300 fluttering through French castle air. Those had been necessary. They had been satisfying in the cold, precise way that justice delivered to its proper scale is always satisfying. But they were not the thing. The thing was this: warm sunlight on a rooftop, A healthy child running because he can, a business thriving because I built it, and a life that was mine in every dimension. A life that the people who had spent 30 years insisting I wasn't enough for anything had no access to, no part of, and no ability to diminish. They had tried to bury me in their shadow. They had instead forced me to learn the precise extent of my own light. I was not the victim of their story anymore. I was the author of my own empire, and the story I was writing was one in which a 7-year-old boy ran across a rooftop lawn in full health while his mother watched and drank her tea and smiled. The war was over. Everything worth having had been won. I leaned back in my chair, felt the sun on my face, and did not look back. There was nothing behind me worth the attention. The most enduring truth woven through this story is one that takes most people most of their lives to fully understand. Biology does not automatically confer the title of family. True family is constituted by unconditional support, genuine respect, and the willingness to show up during the darkest moments without calculating the cost. For years, Caroline absorbed her parents' and sisters' diminishment because the dominant cultural narrative insists that blood relationships must be endured regardless of what they contain. That loyalty to family is a value that supersedes the requirement for family to deserve loyalty. Her journey demonstrates with considerable force that sharing DNA is not a sufficient justification for financial exploitation, psychological manipulation, or the sustained, deliberate cruelty of people who have decided you are worth less than they are. We shrink ourselves to fit the narrow, suffocating containers that toxic relatives construct for us, and we convince ourselves that this shrinking is love. Caroline's ultimate triumph was not simply the exposure of her parents' crimes, or the dismantling of a fraudulent empire, or the sight of a fake billionaire led away from his own rehearsal dinner in handcuffs. Her real victory was the recognition of her own inherent unqualified worth, and the absolute courage to build an impenetrable boundary around it. She understood finally that she did not need to prove anything to people who had committed themselves to misunderstanding her. By severing the financial and emotional infrastructure that had sustained their toxicity, she dissolved the ecosystem they depended on and reclaimed the energy that had been hemorrhaging into it for 33 years. The most devastating response to those who attempt to destroy you is not loud, retaliatory vengeance. It is the quiet, relentless accumulation of an extraordinary life, maintained with the clinical detachment of someone who no longer needs her abusers to witness it in order for it to be real. When you permanently remove toxic individuals from your life, you create the space in which your actual potential can inhabit its full dimensions. You owe nothing to people who view you as a resource to be consumed. Healing begins at the exact moment you decide to protect your peace, walk away without explanation, and build something beautiful that the people who underestimated you will never be permitted to enter.